Stephen.Port is a British serial killer and serial rapist who murdered a minimum of 4 men between 2014 and 2015. However, he is known to have begun drugging and raping men from at least 2012. He met all of his victims through online dating applications, leading to him being dubbed the Grindr Killer. There are 2 sides to this story. First, the horrific crimes of Port, but also the inaction of the police, which meant that the victims' families were not taken seriously, and they suffered further pain outside of losing loved ones. Port was also free to kill and kill again. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Stephen.Port was born on the 22nd of February 1975 in Southend, in the county of Essex, to Joan and Albert Port. He also had an older sister, Sharon. There's little information about Port's early upbringing, but no indicators of abuse, although it's stated that his father had an issue with homosexuality, and therefore Port kept his attraction to males secret from his parents. Growing up, Port was described as being extremely isolated and considered strange by his classmates, and he was frequently bullied. One of his classmates described her interactions with Port, stating, quote, "He was quiet, shy and a loner, who sat on his own in class. The other class members were really not nice to him, and sometimes you could see the hurt on his face when they were really nasty. I was the only one that really talked to him because it wasn't right how he was treated. I told him to ignore them. We weren't really friends, as I myself found him a bit odd." After leaving school at the age of 16, Port went to art college, but it proved too expensive for his parents, and he spent 2 years training as a chef instead. Port was described as a strange man, and, despite his 6'5" frame, was extremely childlike, and even in adulthood was immature and liked to play with children's toys. Port lived at home with his parents until his early 30s, but in 2006 moved into his own property, 62 Cook Street in Barking, East London, where he committed his offences and will remain until his arrest years later. It's clear that Stephen.Port struggled in the real world due to his awkwardness and general lack of social skills. However, on the internet, he could portray himself as anything he wanted to be and would spend all day, every day online, rarely leaving his flat. On the internet, he claimed to have been a graduate of Oxford University, served in the armed forces, and worked as a special needs teacher in London. None of this was true. It said Port worked for 13 years as a chef at West Ham bus depot and also did other work, such as door-to-door sales. Similarly, as opposed to being a balding man in his 30s, Port would post numerous pictures wearing a wig, clearly trying to make himself more attractive to other men, but also making himself look younger. As an aside, the television show Celebrity MasterChef had an episode filmed in West Ham bus station, and Stephen.Port appears in the background, albeit briefly. This episode aired in mid-2014, so it was likely filmed earlier that year, or potentially in 2013, so before he committed the murders. However, by this point, he was already a rapist, and it must have been strange for everyone involved in this episode, knowing that they were standing mere feet away from a future serial killer. Anyway, it's clear that Port was a man obsessed with sex, specifically with younger men, and, at an inquest of one of his victims, it was revealed that he'd sent hundreds of thousands of messages to men on applications such as Grindr, and his neighbours noticed a revolving door of young-looking men going into his apartment. It got to the point where, due to how young the men looked, his neighbours were concerned Port was a paedophile. Port would also use drugs as part of his sexual activities with these men, specifically GHB, the drug originally developed as an anaesthetic, sometimes known simply as G. It's known to reduce inhibitions, increase libido, and sexual sensations become much more intense. It's commonly known as a, quote, date rape drug, due to its ability to cause unconsciousness and memory loss, and also because it's an odourless, colourless liquid that can be easily put in someone's drink without them noticing. However, it's also a highly dangerous drug, and in high enough doses can cause coma or even death. Also found on Port's laptop was obsessive viewing of, quote, date rape pornography, where he would watch scenarios, likely simulated, but potentially not, where men had sex with other men whilst one of them was unconscious. Port would watch hours of this material, each and every day. It's clear that Port began to want to replicate this behaviour and, by 2012, had put his plan into action. It's not clear how many men Stephen.Port actually raped, but in court, the earliest victim he was known to have attacked was a 19-year-old university student who Port met on Grindr in 2012. The pair chatted, and this male went to Port's flat, describing as being, quote, polite and friendly, and that, quote, nothing rang alarm bells. He was then given a glass of wine and noticed congealed powder in the bottom of the glass and immediately believed he'd been spiked. He then became dizzy and disorientated before losing consciousness. He had a vague recollection of being taken into the bedroom, undressed and raped by Port, but was unable to wake himself or fight back. This male was allowed to live and quickly left the property. It appears he was unsure whether what had happened was real or imagined, but when he got to university, he sought medical advice as he believed he'd been drugged. In January 2013, a man called the police and made an allegation that he'd been raped by Port on New Year's Eve 2012 and that he'd done this on several occasions before that. This male said that Port had plied him with drugs and alcohol to the point he was so under the influence he couldn't say no or fight back, and on each occasion, Port had anally raped him. It doesn't appear that Port was arrested for this allegation, and nothing came of it, although an entry was put on the police national computer database. The next victim was a male known only as B in court records. B was aged 20 when he met Stephen.Port on a dating site for gay men. B went to Port's flat in Barking in June 2014 and stated that Port seemed, quote, a very nice guy. B was offered a drink and almost immediately fell unconscious. When he woke up, he was terrified and began shouting and screaming for help. Port, rather than calling ambulance, supported B whilst walking to Barking train station. B was in a terrible state, vomiting profusely and hardly able to stand. When they got to the station, they were seen by officers from the British Transport Police who saw B incoherent, distressed and vomiting. Port told them that everything was okay and that B had just taken GHB. In court, it couldn't be proved that Port had actually raped B. However, even if this didn't occur, it was clearly the intention. In amongst the crimes against these two men, Port also repeatedly drugged and raped a male known only as C. A couple of things can be taken from this. Firstly, it's clear that Port was drugging men at least 2 years before he began committing the murders, with the intention of raping these individuals. This makes me certain he must have raped far more men than we know about, as it's unlikely that a man this obsessed with sex and heavily invested in date rape porn would have such large gaps between his offences. Unfortunately, there were likely significant issues of shame with these victims, who likely could not recall their attacks and potentially convinced themselves that any physical injury they suffered was as a result of consensual sexual activity they could not remember. Others may have felt they could not report it for other reasons, i.e. already being in a relationship, or potentially they felt the police wouldn't take them seriously, which unfortunately, given what happened after this point, seems to be a concern well-founded. Secondly, the first victim referred to seeing powder in his drink. I think that Port was experimenting with different drugs for years to determine which would be the most effective at disabling his victims. GHB is a white crystalline powder in its raw form, but it's never normally sold this way. Instead, is mixed with water to create a liquid solution. So whatever you put in the first victim's drink was something else. I think he then switched to GHB because it's harder to detect and potentially much more effective. Lastly, I think that Port saw the attack on B as a mistake, and that due to his screaming and crying out for help, he was forced to accompany him to the train station, and there he came across the police. I think that Port saw this as a close call, and he believed he needed to ensure this would never happen again. He needed to make sure his victims were completely under his control, with no chance of escaping, and he could not risk being caught again walking the streets with someone he'd just drugged. So Port decided that these men would not leave his flat alive. Within days of the incident with B, Port was again on the prowl, and over the next year, he engaged in a campaign of rape and murder driven by his deviant and predatory sexual appetites. Stagecoach's first confirmed murder victim was 23-year-old Anthony Walgate. It wasn't pronounced Anthony. Anthony was 23 years old and originally from Hull, a city in East Yorkshire, but he moved down to London in order to attend fashion college. He was the son of a woman called Sarah Sack, a woman whose grit and determination is central to the eventual downfall of Stagecoach. Unfortunately, Anthony was struggling financially and so turned to escorting to make money. On the 17th of June 2014, he was contacted by Stagecoach, who arranged sexual services in exchange for payment of £800. It should be noted that Port had no personal savings, and therefore he clearly had no intention of paying Anthony. Anthony travelled to Barking Station, where the pair met at approximately 10:15 p.m, and then went back to Port's flat. What happened next is known only to Port, but it's clear that soon after arriving, Anthony was given a fatal dose of GHB, likely in the laced drink, and he fell unconscious. Whether Port raped him whilst he was alive, dying, or indeed dead is unclear. The next day, Port stayed in the flat with Anthony's body and then went to work a late shift. He returned at 4 a.m. on the 19th of June 2014 and, after dressing Anthony's body, dragged him outside, propping him up by a wall right next to the entrance to the flat complex. Port took Anthony's mobile phone so that their communications could not be seen, plunged a small bottle of GHB on his body, and then made the following anonymous 999 call.
Emergency ambulance. What's the address of the emergency?
It's Cook Street. There's a young boy. Looks like he's collapsed outside. I don't know.
Outside of which number?
4758.
Sorry?
4758, I think.
47 Cook Street.
Yeah.
What area?
Barking. He looks like he's collapsed or had a seizure or something. He's just always just drunk. But yeah.
Okay. What's the telephone number you're calling from?
I'm just pulled up in the car. I've got to get my card on the parking. Oh.
That's alright, don't worry about that. What's the telephone number you're calling from?
Just before 8 a.m. on the 19th of June 2014, paramedics and the police attended, and it was clear that Anthony was dead. Suspicions were raised almost immediately, as Anthony was in a sitting position cross-legged, with the paramedics who attended believing that if he'd have simply died from a seizure, he would not have been sat bolt upright. He would likely have slumped over. Also, it was clear that Anthony had been dead for some time. It appeared clear that he died somewhere else, been moved, and then posed. In addition, whilst a small detail, Anthony's underwear was on back to front, which his friends said was never something he would do due to being fashion conscious. At a later inquest, it appears the paramedics did raise their suspicions with the police, but nothing was acted upon. An autopsy showed that Anthony had died from a drug overdose. Sarah Sack was on holiday in Turkey when her son died, and she rushed back to the UK when she heard the news. Her contact with the police was appalling, with the initial phone call telling her son had died apparently lasting only a few minutes, and it was clear there was no investigation into her son's death. The family liaison officer assigned to her had apparently written that Anthony liked to drink and had, quote, dabbled in drugs, specifically cocaine, something Sarah vehemently denied later. Sarah battled the police for months, insisting that her son was murdered, and she criticised the behaviour of the Metropolitan Police in London. Port did eventually fall on the police's radar, as, although he'd taken Anthony's mobile, they were able to trace the number of the phone that made their 999 call. Also, Anthony had told a friend where he was going and who he was meeting. This led to Stagecoach being arrested on the 26th of June 2014. At this point, Port's story magically changed. Anthony had been in his property and they had arranged money for sex, but Anthony had then taken GHB in front of him and died. Port said, due to panicking, he dragged him outside, propped him up, and then called 999. Alarm bells should have been ringing, Port was clearly lying to the police on at least one occasion. Also was the fact that Anthony had been dead for some time when he was found. He also had no history of using GHB, and if anyone had bothered to look into Port, they would have seen an allegation of rape against a male using drugs in 2012. However, none of this was done, and Port was only charged with perverting the course of justice due to making false reports to the police, and he was released on bail. Another major mistake was the police seized Port's laptop, but it was not examined for 10 months. If it had been checked before, they would have found multiple searches for date rape porn. Within 5 weeks, and while still on bail, Port committed his second murder. Gabriel Kovari was aged 22 and born in Slovakia, but moved to the UK in June 2014 for a better life and was hoping to work for the NHS as a translator. Despite only being in the UK for less than 2 months, Gabriel saw the best and unfortunately the worst in people. He originally met a man called John Pape in July 2014. The pair developed a friendship as opposed to a relationship, and Gabriel moved in with him. Although their friendship only lasted 6 weeks, the pair became close. John was upset when on the 23rd of August 2014, Gabriel moved out, having told him he'd met a man online who'd offered him a place to stay. This man was Port. It's clear that Port had sexual intentions towards Gabriel as soon as he moved in, with him sending a text to a neighbour telling him he should come round and meet, quote, his new Slovakian twink flatmate, and that he was, quote, taking good care of him, suggesting there was more than just friendship going on between the pair. However, it appears that Gabriel soon regressed his decision, as he was not attracted to Port and had been sleeping on the sofa, but knew that Port would try to get him into bed. Sometime after 5 a.m, on the 25th of August 2014, Port administered a fatal dose of GHB in order to rape Gabriel. Port then took to covering his tracks, including using a false identity online, contacting Gabriel's friends, telling them that Gabriel had left the country. By chance, later in the day on the 25th of August 2014, Port's sister rang and later stated in court that her brother was distressed because there was a dead young man in his room. Port, the pathological liar that he appears to have been, later stated in court that the dead young man that he referred to in the conversation with his sister was Anthony Walgate, who had died over a month before, and that he was apparently having some sort of flashback. Absolute bollocks. Gabriel's body remained in the flat for some time, clearly whilst Port tried to figure out his next move. In the early hours of the 28th of August 2014, Port transported Gabriel's body, lightly wrapped in a bedsheet, to St Margaret's churchyard, approximately 500 metres away from his home. He then placed Gabriel against a wall in a sitting position. Port posed him, placing a pair of sunglasses on his face so someone who saw him at a distance would think he was just asleep. At around 6 a.m. that day, so a few hours later, a woman called Barbara Denham was walking her dogs past a graveyard where she saw a young man sat up against a wall who she thought was asleep. She called out, but there was no response. She then went up to him and touched him, and concerned that he may have been dead, called the police. Again, a bottle of GHB had been plastered on Gabriel's body. Police attended, and it was clear that Gabriel was dead. For some inexplicable reason, the death was determined to not be suspicious, with them assuming that Gabriel had accidentally taken a fatal dose of GHB and simply died where he was found. No post-mortem was conducted, and Gabriel's body was released to his family overseas for burial. John Pape was informed of the death of his friend and was in shock. He had no indication that Gabriel was a drug user, and he raised his concerns about the conclusions drawn by the police. He pointed out the similarities between the death of Gabriel and Anthony Walgate. Specifically, how strange it was that two young men should die of an overdose of the same drug within 500 metres of each other in less than 2 months. The police ignored his concerns. The police also stonewalled Sarah Sack, who was still trying to be heard about her son. She too had heard about the death of Gabriel and was convinced that there was a link to her son's death. Of course, she was correct. But she was ignored. So Port was in the clear and free to kill again and to claim his third victim. Daniel Whitworth was a 23-year-old chef who had his whole life ahead of him. He lived with his partner, but unfortunately was also using dating websites for gay men. And on the 18th of September 2014, he travelled to Barking train station and met with Port, and the pair went back to his flat. Sometime over the next few hours, Daniel was administered with a fatal dose of GHB and raped. Whilst Daniel lay dead in the property, Port began to cover his tracks. He deleted his dating profile and wrote an apparent suicide note, which he then planted on Daniel's body before, under the cover of darkness on the evening of the 19th of September 2014, he took Daniel's body to the same graveyard where he'd dumped Gabriel's remains. The next morning, a dog walker found his body. Not just any dog walker, Barbara Denham, the same woman who found the body of Gabriel a month before. She later reported her utter disbelief at being confronted by the same situation again. She approached Daniel's body, which was again propped up against the wall, touched his stomach, felt that he was cold, and then called the police for a second time, saying she'd found a body. The body of Daniel was literally 5 feet away from the spot where Gabriel's body had been found. Police attended and determined there was nothing that could be done for Daniel. Again, he was found with a bottle of GHB on him, but if they bothered to check, they would have found Port's DNA on his jacket from where he'd been redressed after being murdered. They also found an apparent suicide note, which read, quote, "I'm sorry everyone, mostly to my family, but I can't go on anymore. I took the life of my friend, Gabriel Klein. We was just having some fun at a mate's place, and I got carried away and gave him another shot of G. I didn't notice while we was having sex, he had stopped breathing. I tried to get him to start breathing again, but it was too late. It was an accident, but I blame myself for what happened. I didn't tell my family I went out. I know I would go to prison if I went to the police. I can't do that to my family, and at least this way, I can at least be with Gabriel again. I hope he will forgive me. By the way, please do not blame the guy I was with last night. We only had sex, then I left. He knows nothing of what I've done. I've taken what G I have left with sleeping pills, so if these kill me, it's what I deserve. Feeling dizzy now, as took 10 minutes ago, so hoping you understand my writing. I dropped my phone on my way here, so it should be in the grass somewhere." This whole situation, but especially the note, should have been a massive red flag. Firstly, you have 3 young men, all found dead within 500 meters of each other, 2 of them mere feet apart, in the space of 2 months. None of whom were known to be regular users of GHB. If proper checks had been done, they would have found it odd that Daniel apparently was so bereft at killing his good friend Gabriel that he got his surname wrong, calling him Klein instead of Kavari. Also, they would have found the whole situation very odd, considering that Daniel had never even met Gabriel, and there was no evidence they even knew of each other's existence. Also, was an oddly phrased suicide note, with the man apparently in the throes of grief and utter despair that he'd taken the life of his friend, but he takes time to mention the man he just had sex with and says not to blame him. Blame him for what? Why even mention that at all? Clearly mention of sexual activity between Gabriel and Daniel in this note was to make the police think that any evidence of this would be explained. In addition, if they'd bothered to check the phone records of Gabriel and Daniel, they would have seen they were nowhere near each other on the date that Gabriel died. Clearly, Stagecoach thought he was very clever, trying to pin Gabriel's murder on Daniel, but this note is amateur hour for the reasons I've mentioned, and this should have launched a major investigation due to the overwhelming evidence that a serial killer was operating in the area. But nothing happened. Sarah Sack was still fighting for justice for her son, but was also now fighting for the families of both Gabriel Kavari and Daniel Whitworth. The families united and continued to put pressure on the police to take things seriously and actually investigate crimes, but they were all ignored. However, there is shocking evidence of very underhanded tactics employed by the police. In particular, in the case of Daniel's death, police records claim that the handwriting in the suicide note was confirmed as being a match to Daniel by his family, something they stated never happened. So the police chalked his death up to a suicide and made no attempts to investigate further. Stagecoach apparently did not kill again for a year, but he continued to drug and rape other men. He attacked at least 3 men, known as males D, E and F. Male D was extremely vulnerable. He met Port in January 2015 and had his drink spiked to his flat and was then raped. Port filmed the rape, then showed it to D, who was obviously horrified. At this point, there's a gap of a few months in Port's offending, but this is only because he finally went to court for perverting the court of justice related to the death of Anthony Walgate. On the 23rd of March 2015, Port was sent to prison for 8 months for this offence. The court had no idea the man they were sending down for this simple offence had killed at least 2 people and raped multiple men. Port was released on June the 4th, 2015, and within a month had attacked another man. This was E, who was 35 years old and who met Port on Grindr in July 2015. By this point, Port appears to have been experimenting with different ways to drug men, and so, when the pair were at his flat, Port used a syringe to inject drugs straight into the anus of E. E felt a burning, painful sensation and immediately knew something was wrong. He got up, dressed, and left. Male F was already known to Port, and they reconnected via Grindr in September 2015. Again, F went to his flat, but he made it clear he did not wish to do any drugs. Under the pretense of applying lubrication, Port again injected drugs directly into F's anus. He felt a burning sensation and started to feel lightheaded, but luckily did not fall unconscious and was able to escape. Why Port let these men live is unclear, but I think that even he knew that he got away with things up to this point and that he couldn't risk having another dead body on his hands. However, his murderous impulses took over and he would claim another victim soon afterwards. Jack Taylor was a 25-year-old man who lived with his parents in Dagenham and worked as a forklift driver. On the 12th of September 2015, Jack went out drinking with his friends. He then went home and accessed Grindr and began speaking to Port, and they agreed to meet at Barking train station. This haunting CCTV footage shows the pair meeting and walking back to Port's flat, essentially Jack's last walk. I don't know about you, but there's part of me that just wants to shout, telling Jack to stop and go home, however ridiculous that might sound. What happened in Port's flat will never be known for certainty, but it's clear that Jack was drugged and raped and was dead by 7:30 a.m, so around 4 hours after meeting Port, as he then began covering his tracks, deleting the Grindr app from both his and Jack's phone in order to delete the messages. Jack's body remained in the flat the entire day of the 13th of September 2015, and when it got dark, Port again carried or dragged his body to the same graveyard where he disposed of his last 2 victims. He placed Jack's body propped against a wall, again just a few feet away from where he dumped Gabriel and Daniel, but this time on the opposite side of the wall. Port planted a bottle of GHB on Jack, as well as a syringe, and took his phone, dumping it. Jack's body was found by a passerby, this time not the same dog walker as before, and the police were called. Again, stunningly, they appeared to take the evidence at face value and determined that Jack had probably taken a fatal overdose, potentially accidentally. Case closed. Jack's family were informed of his passing and were adamant that something was wrong. They stated that Jack had aspirations of becoming a police officer and so was very firmly anti-drug. It got to the point where Jack's family were doing their own investigation, compiling their own handwritten evidence and sending it to the police. However, they, like Sarah Sack, who was still banging down every door and calling everyone she could, were ignored, with the police stating there was no reason to link Jack's passing to any of the 3 previous deaths in the last 16 months. It appears that Stagecoach was caught by chance in the end. A detective reviewing the death of Anthony Walgate happened to see the CCTV footage of Jack Taylor walking from Barking train station with a male. When this detective looked at the footage, he realised the person walking with Jack was Stagecoach, a man who'd been involved in the case of Anthony. At this point, the pieces finally fell into place, with links being made with all the victims in port, and his background was properly checked and the content of his laptop reviewed. A new team of investigators were assigned, and finally, on the 15th of October 2015, Stagecoach was arrested on suspicion of 4 counts of murder. He was interviewed the next day, and, whilst he didn't go no comment, he gave very little truthful information. I've included the full release clip of the interview, which is 11 minutes long, as I think it's fascinating, but also people who like analysing body language will have plenty of material. If you want to skip it, as I said, it's about 11 minutes long.
So did you have any involvement in the death of the male that we just spoke about a short while ago, Gabriel Cavari or Gabriel Klein?
No, I did not. No.
So, were you involved in administering any drugs or poisons or noxious substances to him?
No, I don't administer drugs to anyone or give drugs to anyone. That's done at the party by someone else. The name I recognised, one of the parties I mentioned before, was he's normally at the parties and deals with administrating drugs.
Who's that, sorry?
Daniel. Recognised him. He deals, he hands out the drugs to the guests.
Daniel. This is the male
Yeah.
that we spoke of earlier.
So, it might not be the same guy, I really don't know, but he's the only Daniel I know. Or, I mean, I've spoken to him a couple of times at the party. I don't remember his name. He does, like when I did, Scott would ask him to pick up guys, take them to the party, and he would stay, but he would stay and administer or do out hand out drugs or whatever, but I would leave or he would stay.
And did you go with Daniel to meet people?
No, I knew he was doing the same as I was, but I'd see him at the party and had a brief conversation with him about it, but I've never actually engaged with him outside of the place.
Outside of the party?
Right.
And which parties were these?
Scott calls the fat parties.
Scott's parties?
Yeah.
The fat party?
Fat party, F-R-A-T.
Frat parties? So when was the first occasion that you met the person that you're talking of, someone that you know as Daniel?
I think I was on the first few occasions I was there. It was the first time I photographed for Scott, and Daniel was there. So I don't even know if it is the same Daniel I was talking about, but he's the only Daniel I can recall as such. remember. I think his name was Whitworth. It rings a bell, but
You think his name was Whitworth?
I mean, if he's a tall, almost as tall as me, with brown hair, slim.
Might help if I show you a picture. We'll call this CRT 2. This is Jack Taylor. Do you recognise that mate?
No, I just don't recognise him. I don't pay full attention to the guy's faces when I have paid attention to the parties. But I don't recognise his face.
So you don't recognise his face?
I do not know. No.
And I mean, that's Jack Taylor, so you don't recognise
No, I don't.
Jack Taylor?
No.
So, have you ever slept with this male?
No.
Had sexual intercourse with him?
It doesn't look like the type I would go with myself.
He's not the sort of person you'd go for?
No, I tend to it's more younger, drinky boys, more younger boys, but not. He looks older. He could be similar to the type I've taken to parties, but I don't recognise him as being one of them.
So you don't recognise him as being one of them?
No.
No. Okay. And Jack, again, was found dead. This was on the 14th of September 2015. Stephen, did you have any involvement in his death?
I did not know. No.
Did you kill Jack Taylor?
I did not know. No.
Did you administer any drugs or noxious substances to him
I did not know.
with the intention of causing him harm?
No. Definitely not. No.
No. And you say you've never seen him before. Is that right?
That's right.
That's right. Okay, I've got another map here, CRT8. I'm just trying to show you as many maps of the area because it's not easy to get it all on one piece of paper, just so that we're clear really. And again, it shows your home address and it shows the church St Margaret, and behind it you've got the abbey and the primary school. In particular, the area around the walls of the abbey. Have you ever had any reason to go into that area?
No.
Have you ever been through into the abbey?
No, I haven't. No. No, I don't generally go to the church areas. No. No. I think I once went to that church with my ex Danny. Went to the church on a Christmas day. Went into the church, but that's as far as I got. As far as
You've not been into the grounds behind it, where you've got the old abbey walls.
No, gosh,
The grounds there.
No, it looks so spooky, so I won't go there.
You've never been in there.
No.
In all the 8 years that you've lived across the road from the park.
I thought it was all private. I wouldn't go there. I think it's a private area. I thought. It belongs to the church.
It's fairly open, isn't it, when you go past? Would you agree with that or not?
And the fields, yeah, the
Yeah.
field is, but the church bit behind the walls, we won't go past there.
Because 3 of the 4 people that have been found dead were found slumped up against the wall here of the Abbey.
Gosh.
Pardon?
Yeah, I didn't know that.
You didn't know that? So that's news to you, is it? Did you put them there?
No.
So obviously Anthony was found slumped outside your address with a large amount of GHB in his system. The other 3 men we've been discussing were all found over by the wall area of the Abbey. We can see on the map. Again, all of them were slumped against the wall with a large amount of GHB in their body. Can you account for that at all?
No, I can't.
I mean, Stephen, did you write this letter here, CRT 11?
No, I didn't.
The photos of it that's found with Daniel.
No. No. If you're not,
Are you telling us the truth, Stephen,
I'm telling you the truth, yes.
about the letter?
Yes. 100% truth.
About all of these boys?
Yeah.
Young boys? In the early stages of their youth, really, in terms of in their early 20s. All found dead. Stephen?
Yeah, I understand, but
Close to your house. One of them had been in your house, either just before or at the time when he died, and was found to have large quantities of a drug in his system. The other 3 were all found just over the road in the churchyard, or just beside the churchyard in that area that we've discussed,
yeah.
propped up against a wall, short distance from your house, all again with high levels of GHB in them, enough to kill them. Highly unusual way to die for one person. This is 4 all found very close to where you live. All men, young men, type of men that you say that you find attractive. All now dead, Stephen.
As it happened, Anthony, I know nothing about the other 3, how they come to be.
Stephen, this is serious,
Yes, I know.
okay? It's really important that you tell us the absolute truth.
Yeah. Yeah. Everything I've told you so far is true.
Stagecoach pleaded not guilty to all offences and, in October 2016, went on trial at the Old Bailey in London. Port tied himself in knots, and his claims changed rapidly, with him saying that he didn't know the victims, to admitting that he did, and then saying that they were in his flat and that apparently all of them had taken overdoses of GHB in front of him. The court did not believe him, and Stagecoach was found guilty of the murders of Anthony Walgate, Gabriel Cavari, Daniel Whitworth, and Jack Taylor. He was also found guilty of drugging with the intention of raping, or actually raping, 7 men between 2012 and 2015. On the 25th of November 2016, Stagecoach was set for sentencing before Mr. Justice Openshaw, who, whilst running through Port's long list of offences, stated, quote, "Self-evidently, the defendant is highly dangerous." He then sentenced him. Justice Openshaw stated, quote, "I had no doubt that the seriousness of the offending is so exceptionally high that the whole life order is justified. Indeed, it is required. The sentence therefore upon the counts of murder is a sentence of life imprisonment a decline to set a minimum term. The result is a whole life sentence, and the defendant will die in prison. Therefore, Stagecoach joined the list of prisoners in the UK who will never be released. To this day, he continues to maintain his innocence for his offences. After Stagecoach was caught, and due in large part to the victims' families, the Metropolitan Police referred itself to the Independent Office for Police Conduct, the IOPC, and an investigation was launched. The police looked at the involvement of 17 officers involved in Stagecoach's case and found that 9 had demonstrated performance which had, quote, fallen below the standard required. They were reprimanded for, quote, performance failings, but allowed to remain in service. And, to add insult to injury, in 2021, the Metropolitan Police confirmed that 5 of these officers had been promoted. The coroner's inquest stated that inaction in the investigation of Anthony Walgate's death, quote, probably contributed to the deaths of the other 3 men. In June 2022, the IOPC stated they would be launching a fresh inquiry into the police's handling of the Stagecoach case, but given that the original investigation took 2 years, there'll be no answers quickly, and by the time a report is published, potentially these same officers will have been promoted again. I think the term probably is indicative of British culture, with us being very polite and not wishing to offend. I'll leave it to my viewers to determine what they think, but I would say the police failings definitely led to Port being allowed to kill and rape people after his first murder. All of the victims' families and friends accused Metropolitan Police of institutional homophobia. They also pointed out how inevitably the police would have handled this case differently if the 4 victims had been women. I think it's horrific that the family and friends of these young men had to basically put their grief aside in order to become detectives, because the people whose job it actually was to do this were so useless. Total respect then. So, what could be said about Stagecoach? What was the thinking of this serial murderer? I think that ultimately Port's behaviour was driven by inadequacy. He was a man who had poor social skills, a menial job, and, at quite a young age, was losing his hair. These are clearly things that Port wasn't able to come to terms with, so he had to project lies about success on the internet and walk around with a wig in order to project the man he wanted to be, not the person he was. The internet was his escape. On there, he could be anyone he wanted. He could feel a sense of belonging and acceptance, likely from the thousands of men he interacted with online. It's common for men and women who have significant issues with their self-esteem to use sex as a way to make themselves feel better temporarily. In these moments, they feel wanted, and temporarily they can forget about how they actually feel. Chasing this feeling can become addictive, and it's clear that this was the case with Stagecoach. While Stagecoach is known as the Grindr Killer, he used around 10 different dating websites and apps and was obsessed with filling his life with sexual encounters, which I think were an escape from his daily life. I think that Port being described as childlike is also a relevant part to understanding him. As a child, we are taught self-control and that we can't have everything we want. Port appears to have learnt neither of these things. However, I think that as time went on, this didn't have the same impact on Port. The high of meeting random men for sex was starting to wane. He needed to escalate his behaviour. Port became obsessed with rape pornography. I think watching this gave him an idea of how to use sex to have control over another human being, and he started to replicate what he'd seen. He also took people's lives, which was the ultimate demonstration of his power over them. I imagine that Port was most likely ecstatic going through the list of men online, thinking about who he could have sex with their level of consent meaning nothing. They were just objects to use and abuse. When he met them, it didn't matter that he had extremely poor social skills, or was very odd, or wore a wig. They wouldn't live long enough to mock him about these things. He was in complete control. Once he had finished with one victim, he dumped them like rubbish, before moving on and looking for more men to drug, rape, and murder. Watching footage of Stagecoach makes me realise just how good Stephen Merchant's performance was in the 2022 series called 4 Lives, which, if you can find it, is well worth a watch. I think it's still on BBC iPlayer. In my opinion, Stephen Merchant perfectly captures the strange, lumbering demeanour of Port, but also hints at something else, especially during the court scenes, extreme violence and anger. And I think deep within Port, despite his quiet and shy demeanour, is a core of anger and violent tendencies which he had no desire to control. Stephen Port is inevitably a psychopath, and, if released, I've no doubt he would keep killing. However, he'll never get the chance, as Stephen Port's life will end behind prison bars. So, what are your thoughts? Ian Watkins had it all. Adoring fans due to the success of his band Lost Prophets, millions of pounds in the bank, and offers to play some of the biggest festivals around the world. However, Watkins was in fact two people. One, the talented musician, the other, one of the most depraved paedophiles the UK has ever seen, who used his fame to abuse his fans and gain access to children. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Ian Watkins was born on the 30th of July 1977 in Wales and met his future Lost Prophets bandmate Mike Lewis whilst they were still at school. Their love of music led to them forming their first band as teenagers, who used to play in Watkins' garage. After being in a number of bands, in 1997 Watkins, Lewis and several other musicians formed the rock band Lost Prophets, who made their live debut in 1997. The band initially only saw limited success in the South Wales scene, playing gigs at venues across Wales, including Newport. It was the release of their debut album The Fake Sound of Progress in 2000, which brought them to wider attention, and from there the band's fan base exploded, leading to Lost Prophets playing support for bands such as Linkin Park and Deftones, as well as headlining gigs of their own. Over the next 12 years, the band released 4 more records, sold 3.5 million albums worldwide, and played some of the biggest festivals in the world, including Glastonbury. They earned particular success in the UK with the songs Last Train Home and Rooftops. This next clip shows Watkins talking about the band's comeback after a hiatus in 2012.
Kind of weird because to us, we've never been away from ourselves. Americans forget that there are other countries out there. There's a whole world outside of America, you know. The last record didn't come out in America, but, you know, went platinum in the UK and we did, you know, tours, just toured it constantly, and it was like, and then on this new record, this is our first record on a major label in the UK, because all the other ones have been on indie. It's kind of weird. It's not that, like, we'd forgotten or given up on America, because like 4 of the guys live in LA, you know what I mean, and married American girl, so they're like, we gotta tour America, and I'm like, well, you know, yeah, cool, but if not, you know what I mean, like I love playing America, but I'm not gonna lose sleep over it, you know what I mean, it's kind of, but then.
However, there would be no comeback. By the point of this interview, Watkins was mere weeks away from being arrested for horrific crimes he had committed, including the sexual abuse of babies. What's even worse is that the police had known about these crimes for years and had had numerous opportunities to stop him. Concerns related to Watkins were reported as early as 2008, 4 years before his arrest. In December of that year, a former partner of Watkins called social services and said that he'd given their infant child cocaine and touched him inappropriately. This information was passed to South Wales Police, but was not acted upon. By this point, Watkins had already taken advantage of underage fans, including the previous year in 2007, when he'd abused a teenage girl who was a virgin. Watkins got her to dress as schoolgirl's outfit and videoed them having sex, orally, vaginally and anally. He asked her whether she enjoyed being his, quote, underage slut. He also urinated on her face and told her to drink it. In March 2010, information was passed to South Wales Police that Watkins was involved in child pornography and that he had stated that he wished to engage in sexual acts with children. In June 2010, information was again sent to South Wales Police claiming that Watkins was in possession of child pornography and had claimed to have molested a 4-year-old, and he was using social media platforms to groom underage boys and girls. Just 2 months later, in August 2010, South Wales Police received yet another report about Watkins, this time stating he forced young girls from the age of 14 to have sex with him after gigs and recorded the acts on his laptop. Watkins also claimed to have gone on social media, threatening the children that he abused, telling them that he'd get people to come round and, quote, sort them out if they told anyone. Watkins repeatedly boasted and bragged about his behaviour and how he wanted to escalate his offending. It's clear that he thought he was untouchable. In May 2011, this woman, Joanne Majlix, a former partner of Watkins, made a complaint about police inaction surrounding his behaviour. This clip shows part of an interview with her, where she describes her interactions with Watkins.
He began telling me about all the underage fans that he took the virginity of, and he was proud of it, and how he abused them, and how his favourite video that he had was of a 14-year-old schoolgirl stripping off and saying her name and date of birth to the camera just before he took her virginity, and just all the other vile things that he said he'd done to these fans. And that I would say to him, stop talking, I don't want to hear it, just stop talking, it's upsetting me. He started saying that he wanted to get me pregnant just so that he could rape our daughter.
In February 2012, a man made a report to South Wales Police stating his daughter might have been molested by Watkins, who had filmed the assault. There are more reports, including in April 2012, when an Australian national contacted South Wales Police and said that Watkins had boasted about getting a 13-year-old high and having sex with her, and that he hoped she fell pregnant. Watkins also boasts about drugging other young girls to have sex with, and his hopes that they too would get pregnant. In June 2012, South Wales Police were contacted by another individual who stated that Watkins had, quote, an unnatural interest in children, and that he had texted her saying he wanted to drug and rape a baby. So South Wales Police were contacted by multiple people separately, all of whom basically made the same accusations about Watkins, that he was an unrepentant paedophile, and they did nothing. We'll return to this later. However, there was one report which gave an indication of the depravity of Watkins, and which brings up the worst offences he committed. In March 2012, South Yorkshire Police were contacted by a woman, known only as B to this day, who said that she believed that Watkins had sexually assaulted her 10-month-old son at a hotel in Cardiff. She also said there were rumours that Watkins had raped a 5-year-old. However, despite this report, B would end up in the court with Watkins, and her abusive trust of her son is nothing short of sickening. Court records state that B met Watkins in late 2011 when she was 19 years old. She was a fan of the Lost Prophets and was soon in communication with Watkins. B was a mother with a newborn baby, and her contacts with Watkins including them discussing him raping this child. B and Watkins met in a hotel in Cardiff in March 2012 after the pair discussed abusing the child, with B texting Watkins, quote, tell me if you want to get your dick in our boy. They had also both discussed drugging the child. Whether B called police because she was having second thoughts is uncertain, but what is clear is that just a month later, she was fully under Watkins' spell and would do whatever he wanted. Between the 2nd of April and the 3rd of April 2012, B and Watkins stayed in a hotel in London, and she, quote, presented her 10-month-old son to be raped by Watkins. He penetrated this child's mouth with his penis and tried to anally rape him. These acts were filmed, with B heard encouraging Watkins. Then, again whilst being filmed, B sexually abused her own son, including sucking his penis. On the 2nd of August 2012, Watkins sent B a message saying, quote, to be honest though, I think we have gone easy on him so far. Time to teach him and make him learn to love it. There was a second meeting at a hotel in Wales in September 2012, and after this meeting, B sent a picture to Watkins of her licking her son's penis. Anonymity has been given to both mother and child in this case, but obviously that child is still out there, and, inevitably, one day will have questions about their mother. God knows what they'll be told, and how finding out the truth would destroy their entire life. Also in the dock with Watkins was P, another mother who utterly betrayed the trust of her child, this time a baby girl. P was in her early 20s when she began communicating with Watkins in August 2012. Not long afterwards, the pair spoke about abusing her baby girl and moving in together. One of the text message exchanges went as follows. Watkins stated, quote, "If you belong to me, so does your baby." P replied stating, quote, "Understandable, a mother-daughter slave duo worshipping you." Watkins said, quote, "That's all she will know, a life of filth." The contact continued and involved conversations about P and her baby daughter performing oral sex on Watkins and their plan to drug this little girl and force her to have sex with animals. Watkins did not get his hands on this girl, but he watched via webcam whilst P penetrated her daughter's vagina with her finger, and she also sent in pictures of her genitals. None of the calls to the police led to any action, and eventually Watkins' downfall was due to his arrest in September 2012 following the execution of a drugs warrant. This resulted in computers, mobile phones and storage devices being seized, resulting in his sexual offending being exposed. In order to break the code on his laptop, South Wales Police had to employ the services of GCHQ, the UK's communication intelligence agency. On screen is the password that unbelievably was found to be on Watkins' laptop. Watkins appeared in Cardiff Magistrates Court in December 2012, along with B and P, who had been identified and arrested due to the content of his computer. Watkins' barrister indicated that he would plead innocent to all offences. All three were remanded into custody. However, likely realising there was no way he could explain the material on his computer, mobile phones, etc., on the 26th of November 2013, Watkins pleaded guilty to 13 offences, including attempted rape and sexual assault of a child under 13, 3 counts of sexual assault involving children, 6 counts of taking, making or possessing indecent images of children, and 1 count of possessing an extreme pornographic image involving a sex act on an animal. Both B and P pleaded guilty to sexually assaulting their children, as well as facilitating Watkins abusing them. Sentence was set for the 18th of December 2013. During the sentencing hearing, the depravity and remorselessness of Watkins was laid bare. Not only the seriousness of the offences, but his behaviour since being remanded into custody. Specifically, a few days before his sentence, Watkins was recorded on a prison phone call saying, quote, "I do my charm, or do I end up making things worse for myself? Or do I just say I was off my head and can't remember?" He also said that he was going to release a statement saying that his abuse of children was, quote, "mega lols," whilst also stating, quote, "I don't know what everyone is getting so freaked out about." During the hearing, and showing the coward that he is, Watkins, through his barrister, claimed he could indeed not remember his sexual abuse against the children of B and P. None of this was accepted by the judge. Reference was made to a probation pre-sentence report where the author outlined their conversation with Watkins, who described wishing to push ever more extreme sexual boundaries. They assessed him as a dangerous sexual offender and wrote, quote, "It's also my assessment that the child victims in this case appear to be coincidental to his need to dominate and to test out the extent to which his sexual partners would collude and participate in his sexual interests." A police investigator said that Watkins was probably the most dangerous sex offender he had ever seen. Justice John Royce stated that the offences collectively, quote, "plumbed new depths of depravity." He also stated, in reference to Watkins, quote, "I'm satisfied that you are a deeply corrupting influence. You are highly manipulative. You are a sexual predator. You are dangerous. The public, and in particular young females and children, need protection from you." Turning to woman P and woman B, Justice Royce outlined their unspeakable actions and identified that both had utterly abused the trust placed in them as mothers. He then sentenced them. Ian Watkins was sentenced to 35 years in prison. He has to serve at least 19 years before he can apply for parole. Woman P was sentenced to 17 years in prison, to serve half in prison prior to release and the other half to be spent in the community monitored by probation. Woman B was sentenced to 14 years in prison, Again, half of this is served in prison, half in the community being monitored. By my calculation, both B and P will have been released by now. Watkins likely has another 9 years to serve before he can even apply for release. As the expression goes, how the mighty have fallen, Watkins went from a life of luxury to a 60-foot square cell at H&P Prison Wakefield, a Category A prison in Wakefield, West Yorkshire, dubbed the, quote, monster mansion due to the high number of highly dangerous sex offenders who reside at the establishment. However, finally being caught for his crimes and time behind bars appears to have had little impact on Watkins, and he remains a highly dangerous sex offender. In 2017, it was reported that Watkins had been corresponding with a 21-year-old fan in which he joked about her toddler watching her have sex. Whether Watkins still considers his offences mega lols is unclear. What is apparent is that he is where he should be, and the fame that he used to groom and abuse others will inevitably come back to haunt him, as it will be this fame, and now infamy, which will mean that when he is eventually released, he will not have a moment's peace when the papers track his location and report his movements, likely for the rest of his life. As already stated, there were numerous chances to catch Watkins years before his eventual arrest, and this led to an investigation by the Independent Police Complaints Commission, the IPCC, who published a report in the summer of 2016. Within this, they said that 3 detectives from the South Wales force should face disciplinary action after they failed to act on earlier allegations. The report concluded, quote, "The consequence of the force's failings was arguably that a predatory paedophile offended over an extended period of time. The evidence obtained in this investigation suggests that South Wales police were faced with a litany of reports about his behaviour, yet in some instances did not carry out even rudimentary investigation, made errors and omissions, and missed opportunities to bring him to justice earlier than he ultimately was." South Wales police accepted the findings of the report and expressed regret for the handling of the Watkins case. However, I can see that one detective was cleared of misconduct, and I cannot find any information about action being taken against the other 2, so it would seem that nothing actually happened as a result of the police's failings in this case. I have no doubt that Watkins' brazen behaviour and his remorselessness before and after his conviction is because he bought into this idea that as a celebrity, he was untouchable and the rules of normal people did not apply. Unfortunately, this seems to be a common problem. In the UK, the name of Jimmy Savile will go down in infamy as one of the most depraved sex offenders the country has ever seen, but also because he was never convicted in his lifetime, despite everyone knowing what he was. I'm struggling to believe that if Watkins had just been a random guy, that South Wales police would not have arrested him in 2 seconds flat. So, do you think that part of the issue in this case was Watkins being given a pass because he was a celebrity? Why is it that we give celebrities so much leniency and somehow place them above us? Or was it just police incompetence? Or both? Do you think Ian Watkins is one of the most dangerous paedophiles you've heard of? In 2014, Breck Bednar was a 14-year-old schoolboy, and like many children his age, he spent time online gaming and chatting to his friends. Unfortunately, he was targeted and groomed by 18-year-old Lewis Daines, an extremely disturbed and dangerous man who murdered Breck. He then tried to cover his tracks by making the following call to the police.
Essex Police Emergency.
Hi there. Okay. Hello. I need police and a forensics team to my address, please.
What do you mean? What's happened?
My friend and I got into an altercation, and I'm the only one who came out alive.
Breck Bednar was born in London on March 17, 1999, to Lauren and Barry. By 2006, Breck's parents had divorced, and he lived with his mother and his 3 younger siblings, 12-year-old triplets Carly, Chloe, and Sebastian. He was a student at St Bede's School in Red Hill in Surrey in the UK, and a member of the Air Training Corps, 135 Squadron, also in Red Hill, and was described by those who knew him as a polite, warm and compassionate young man. However, Breck struggled to make friends, and, like many children, he spent his time online gaming, forming connections with those he met online. In mid-2013, Breck was introduced to an online gaming group by a friend at church, and this group was run by Lewis Daines, an 18-year-old man who lived in Grays in Essex. There were only 8 members of this online group in total, and Daines was in control, with him banning members of the group at will, and the group communicated via headphones. Daines would boast to the group about his success as a software engineer. He claimed to live in New York, own various properties, and work for the government on top-secret projects. He also told them he had donated $2.5 million in Bitcoin to rebels fighting the government forces in Syria. Daines claimed to be a millionaire, the owner of several companies that were valued in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Daines would make these claims to all the members of the group, but it appears that as time progressed, he began to hone in on Breck, grooming him. Breck clearly loved the attention, believing that a wealthy tech entrepreneur was interested in him. He did not see the danger that he was in, or realize that the person he was talking to was extremely dangerous and a master manipulator. Lewis Daines was born in 1986, and it's reported that he had a troubled life. He was an only child and his parents divorced when he was young. After the separation, Daines' mother left the country and he spent time living with his grandmother and, it's also reported, spent some time in the care system. At the age of 16, so in around 2012, Daines moved into a property owned by his grandparents. Daines was described as a recluse by his neighbours, who barely saw him, with him spending almost all of his time sat in front of his computer gaming. It does appear that Daines had some skill with software engineering, although I cannot find out whether he had qualifications or whether he was simply self-taught. However, he was not a millionaire, did not own any companies, and was clearly a manipulative and narcissistic man who made up lies of extreme wealth and success in order to gain attention, with his stories being in contrast to his real existence, where he was unemployed and living rent-free in his grandparents' house. Daines also had a sexual interest in young boys and had already come to the attention of the police. This included in 2011 when he was arrested by the police on suspicion of 5 offences, including attempted rape, sexual activity without consent, as well as child pornography. This occurred when he was 15 years old, when he attempted to rape another boy. However, this was apparently investigated by Essex police, but he was not charged with any offences. It appears that Daines had set upon using gaming to identify and groom male children for sexual purposes, and in 2013, he had set his sights on Breck Bednar. Breck was clearly taken with the attention of Lewis Daines, a man who was telling him that he too could become a successful software engineer and a millionaire like him because he had, quote, that kind of mind. Daines told Breck that he was wasting his time with school and that they should go into business together. Daines used his power to block people online to isolate Breck, with him blocking his friends and especially those who tried to call him out on his lies. Daines would also get into Breck's head by telling him that his friends were talking about him behind his back and that he was the only one that he could trust. Lauren began to notice a change in her son's behaviour. He stopped going to church and socialising outside of his bedroom and would spend most of his time in front of the computer. She became concerned by the influence Daines was having on Breck, with him frequently telling her all the lies that Daines had told him about his wealth and success, which she was able to see through. Lauren tried to stop contact between Daines and Breck by threatening to take away his computer, but Daines would twist this into Breck's parents trying to control him rather than protect him. Daines convinced Breck that his parents and friends were just jealous and that he was the only one that he could trust and the only one who could see his true potential. During arguments with his mother, Breck would tell his mother, well, Lewis said this or that, and she was becoming increasingly concerned that he was grooming her son. Daines was clearly a skilled manipulator, and was using classic grooming techniques, including establishing a bond with his victim, filling some sort of need in their life, making them feel special and unique, as well as isolating them from others. In December 2013, Brecht's mother Lauren called Essex police, stating that their son was being groomed and she believed he was in danger. The police took no action. She did attempt to end the online relationship between Brecht and Danes, but was unable to control everything her son was doing. She limited his access to electronic devices and added parental controls to lessen his contact with Danes. However, Danes would help Brecht circumvent all of these barriers and encourage him to lie to his parents to remain in control of him. In early 2014, Danes began to put the next stage of his plan into action, meeting Brecht. Danes told Brecht that he was dying and wanted to hand over his business to him. However, they needed to meet face to face at his property in Grays, Essex, so he could show Brecht the ropes before the handover. They arranged a meeting on the 17th of February 2014. What happened on the 17th of February 2014 at Lewis Danes' property in Grays, Essex, was clearly pre-planned, as in the weeks leading up to this date, he bought duct tape, condoms, syringes and cable ties. On the directions of Danes, Brecht told his mother that he was going to stay at a friend's house for a sleepover near their home in Surrey, but he secretly took a train to Grays in Essex, and after taking a taxi to Danes' property, stepped through the front door. What happened next will never be known with certainty, but it appears that soon after arriving, Danes attacked Brecht and tied him up. Police determined that sexual activity had taken place between the pair, but, understandably, they've never disclosed exactly what occurred, but I believe that this was likely non-consensual. Danes then cut Brecht's throat with this knife, causing cataclysmic injuries, resulting in him bleeding to death in minutes. Danes then calmly took a shower and, shockingly, took pictures of Brecht's dead body and shared them online with people, clearly to gain more attention. He took the bloody clothes he was wearing and put them in a rubbish bag. He also dumped his hard drives in water, clearly to erase the contents. And then, only then, he made the 999 call which I partially played during the intro, but here is a fuller version of that call.
Essex Police Emergency.
Hi there. Okay. Hello. I need police and a forensics team to my address, please.
What do you mean? What's happened?
My friend and I got into an altercation, and I'm the only one who came out alive.
Are you telling me you've killed somebody?
Yes, I am.
Right, and who am I speaking to?
My name is Lewis Danes. I'm 18 years old, and I live...
Right, okay. And what's actually happened?
My friend came to stay the night with me yesterday, feeling very down, feeling suicidal. And I woke up this morning, he was in a mess. I tried to calm him down. I hugged him, then said that I was there for him. He shrugged me off.
Can you just bear with me a second? Don't tell me any more, okay? You're telling me he is definitely dead?
Yes, I'm telling you he's definitely dead.
Bear with me a second. Right, okay, Lewis, I need you to just take me back through that again. So what happened last night?
Okay. He came to stay with me because he was feeling down. I tried
What's
my
his
best.
name?
Brecht. B-R-E-C-K. Bednar. B-E-D-N-E-R.
Sorry, B-R-E...
E-C-K.
Brecht?
Yes.
And then his surname is?
Bednar. B-E-D-N-E-R.
Okay, so he came to stay with you.
Look, I can explain this to the officers when they
I
get
will
here.
I need to take these initial details.
I know. He came to stay with me the night. I did my best to comfort him. I woke up this morning. He was in a mess. I tried again.
Right, just slow down again, Lewis. I need to take these details. So did you have an argument with him last night?
No, we were fine.
You were fighting?
No, we were fine. We were fine last night. We both went to sleep. I said that we were fine.
Okay, but why did he come to stay with you?
Because he was fed up with his home life.
Right, because he was fed up with his home life.
He's had a lot of problems. I've known him for a long time. He came to stay with me. I was in Thailand last week on holiday. He was in Spain on holiday.
Okay.
We both got back.
So,
we met up.
You both went to bed, and then what's happened this morning?
I woke up. He was just standing up. He was in a mess, hands on his face. I got up. I put my arms around him, and I said it was okay. He just shrugged me off and said no. I can't remember exactly what he said. He was going on about how he didn't want to go home. He was fed up with his life, and he didn't want to go.
Right,
and
okay.
I have a penknife on the side of, in my room, adjacent to my bed. I have a chest of drawers. After shaving the TV and stuff on there, I had a penknife on there, folded. He picked it up, opened it, and then lost control.
Slow down. Let me just take those details here. Penknife on the bedside table. Brett grabbed this.
Yes.
What, in order to harm himself?
No, in order to harm me. He opened it and then lost control.
To harm informant and opened it. It states he lost control.
In self-defense, put my left arm up to block him from stabbing me effectively. We struggled. I got him to the ground. He got up. I got the knife. Can you not interrupt me with this part?
Okay, go on.
Okay. This is being recorded anyway, isn't it?
Yep.
I grabbed the knife and I stabbed him once in the back of the neck, I believe somewhere near the brainstem. He turned around, tried to carry it on, and I think I stumbled on my chest of drawers. I fell over. I got back up, backed away, and then I don't remember exactly what happened, but the fight ended with me cutting his throat. I believe I turned around and I slashed his throat.
Right.
He fell face first on my bed. I tried to stop the bleeding.
Yep.
He fell onto the floor.
Yep.
I couldn't stop it. His throat was properly cut.
And he's still on the floor?
Yes. He fell onto the bed face first. I was trying to compress the wound at that time. And
Lewis, are you still in the room where Breck is?
No.
Where are you?
Look, don't interrupt me. Just let me explain this if this is being recorded. I didn't know what to do. I felt like...
Right, is the house where you are and where Breck is, yeah? But you're in another room, are you?
Yes, I felt like taking my own life. I don't remember what happened after that. All I know is I dropped the knife in my hallway. I stripped down and just sat in the shower.
Right, you've left the weapon in the hallway.
Yes.
And have spent how long sitting in the shower?
I don't know. Look, are the police on their way? I can hear something.
They are.
Okay, I'm going to go and do my part. Please, thank you for your help.
Right, just listen.
Clearly, Lewis Daines is a narcissist, believing that he was smarter than the police and that his story would be believed without any questions being asked. But it's clear that alarm bells were ringing the second he started speaking on this call. I don't know about you, but if I killed a friend, even by accident, I'd be in an absolute state and probably couldn't string two words together. I definitely wouldn't sound like I was calling to order a pizza or book a taxi. That lack of emotion in this call by a man who's standing with the dead body of a 14-year-old boy that he just murdered at his feet is shocking, and I think highlights the evil of Lewis Daines. It's absolutely chilling. As well as the phone call, the police clearly found it strange that Daines had taken time to clean himself, destroy evidence, post pictures of Breck's body before calling them. It seems that Daines tried to change his story several times, claiming that Breck had tried to stab him and he'd killed him in self-defense, to then claiming that Breck had tried to kill himself with the knife, and when Daines tried to stop him, his throat was cut, apparently by accident. However, none of this was believed, and the evidence did not stack up. Breck had clearly been bound, and there was no evidence of any altercation between the pair. Lewis Daines was charged with murder. Clearly knowing that the case was airtight, Lewis Daines pleaded guilty to the murder of Breck Bednar and was set to be sentenced at Chelmsford Crown Court on the 12th of January 2015 before Mrs. Justice Cox. Daines attended his sentencing hearing wearing a suit and showing no emotion during the hearing and keeping his head down. The only movement from him was him shaking his head when details of the case were read out, which he disagreed with. Specifically, the implication that the murder of Breck was underpinned by a sexual and sadistic motivation. Justice Cox stated, quote, "Having lured the young victim to your flat, you murdered him. You had befriended Breck with a number of other adolescent friends through an online community. Your contact with Breck increased in a sinister way. The precise details of what happened in your flat are unclear and may never be known. I'm sure this murder was driven by sadistic or sexual motivation." She then sentenced him. Lewis Daines was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum tariff of 25 years before he can apply for parole. Before analysing Lewis Daines, it's necessary to outline his further behaviour after his imprisonment. Specifically, on the 26th of November 2015, so 10 months after his sentence, 2 blog posts appeared online entitled, quote, "BBC Documentary, Questions to be Asked," and, quote, "Open Letter from Lewis Daines." Both reported to have been written and posted by Daines himself. They are sickening postings, and it's clear that the main purpose is to cause further harm to the family whilst continuing to minimise his behaviour. I won't read either out completely, but read out parts and comments on these. So the second post starts with, quote, "The purpose of this statement is not intended to cause further distress to the family and friends of Breck. It is to put forward additional details unknown to the general public who did not know Breck or me. I have waited and respected the need for the family and friends of Breck to take full advantage of the media coverage and feel it's now time to release my own statement." Take full advantage of the media coverage. Their son was murdered. This is not media coverage that anyone in Breck's life wanted. And what right do you have to respond? The way this is worded is like a petulant child not getting attention, basically saying, "Why are you paying so much attention to them? What about me?" There's then lots of rambling basically stating that he's not a predatory sex offender against children, but then it becomes more sinister, with Daines stating, quote, "Breck was driven away from family life and towards the virtual world. He drew comfort from the friends he made online. Our community members and myself learned that Breck suffered severe abuse at home. Abuse from someone who was supposed to nurture him and care for him, someone who was supposed to encourage him and support him in his hopes and dreams, and the career path that he had chosen, a career path he shared with us, his online friends, who would listen and try giving advice on how to deal with the abuse. We learned, and some of us witnessed and recorded, that abusive individual regularly coming home in a state of intoxication and letting fly with drunken, abusive behaviour at Breck, shouting and humiliating him, often turning violent, causing Breck to withdraw further into that virtual safe haven that he found online. This he shared with other members and myself. His abuser is well known to police. Various people have previously filed reports of child abuse and domestic violence with the police, which are on record and easily verifiable." He then adds, quote, "On reflection, I believe this is why he formed this strong emotional attachment to me. He obviously drew some kind of comfort in having others and myself to confide in, to talk about his domestic problems and abuse. Someone who encouraged him and tried to help him deal with the abuse and mixed up feelings, trying to advise him to try to choose his own path and not be coerced into careers and fundamental religious beliefs he did not believe in or want to follow. So, Breck was being abused and Danes was there to comfort him. His family drove him online, so basically they, not he, are ultimately responsible for his death. To be clear, there's no evidence of abuse, and even if there was, how does this justify what he did? Curiously, Dane says he won't name the alleged abusers, likely because they don't exist. Danes can't help continue to lie about his success, with him claiming that just prior to murdering Breck, he'd been offered a job abroad and had just returned from a successful business trip. Danes appears to generally feel aggrieved with any implication in the media that his life was not perfect, including the state of his flat, with him responding to reports that it was described as untidy by saying, quote, "The police photographs actually show a very clean, tidy, modern flat inside and outside in a very nice residential street, the opposite of what they describe it as." Sickeningly, this second blog post ends with the lines, quote, "Breck, you'll always be in my thoughts. I hope you're at peace. I am so sorry. Your friend, Lewis Danes." It appears likely that these posts were actually written by Danes, and either he posted them himself, using a mobile phone he obtained in prison, or potentially he dictated it to some weak-minded individual on the outside, who then posted it on his behalf. However, regardless of how it got there, it gives us further information to understand the evil that is Lewis Danes. Of course, we can only speculate, but I believe that he's likely what is known as a malignant narcissist. This is the subcategory of narcissistic personality disorder, which basically involves the sufferer being self-absorbed, having low empathy for others, and expecting special treatment from others due to their apparent superiority. However, this is often a mask, as sufferers usually have extreme issues with their self-esteem and such a fragile ego that they project to others the person they want to be as a way to desperately hide from the person they truly are. Malignant narcissism is considered a severe form of this condition, with sufferers displaying traits of often extremely abusive behaviour, victimizing others in order to get what they want. Traits of a malignant narcissist include being preoccupied with fantasies about beauty, brilliance, success and power, having an inability to handle criticism, being likely to take advantage of others to get what they want, having a lack of empathy for others, having no remorse for hurting others and no interest in apologising unless it benefits them, and having a tendency to blame others for their own bad behaviour. These individuals are practiced liars and manipulators, and will spin the most amazing tales of success, even if they're clearly lies. And, when confronted, they'll refuse to admit any fault and twist the narratives to make themselves seem like the victim. I think, based on these traits, it's easy to see why I think Lewis Danes fits into this category. He is a man who demanded special treatment from others and felt entitled to engage in sex acts with young boys, and would manipulate and coerce anyone to get his own way. His coldness after killing Breck on the phone call to 999, I think, shows his complete lack of any emotion or empathy. He knew that society would frown on his behaviour, but I think he struggles to understand what the issue is. Hence why he felt the need to comment about the media's portrayal of him. His sole focus is on how others see him. He can't get away from the fact he killed Breck, but of course it's everyone else's fault. It's Breck's family's fault for alleged abuse, and he was actually Breck's protector and his friend. His ego is so fragile that he even had to write about the fact that his flat was clean and tidy, and continued to lie about how successful he was. Personality disorders are lifelong conditions, with sufferers engaging with therapy to manage the traits of their condition. However, narcissists do not tend to seek out or accept treatment, as it would involve acknowledging their issues, letting the mask slip. It may be that Lewis Danes has a revelation in years to come, and shows genuine remorse, and tries to make amends for his behaviour. but I doubt it. I'm not sure he has the capacity to feel remorse or any other emotion for anyone but himself. Lewis Daines is a monster, and I think he'll continue to pose a serious risk of harm to others until the day that he leaves this world. The death of Breck destroyed his family's life, and Lauren has been transparent about her struggles to come to terms with the death of her son and best friend, with her explaining that she basically couldn't get out of bed for a year after his death. However, as with many of my videos, it's amazing how brave these people are and how someone keeps going when they've suffered the most horrific of losses. A parent should never have to bury their child. Her heartache must have been compounded when she found out about the blog posts I just mentioned. The family did try to get them taken down, but was stonewalled, with them being told they needed to speak to Daines about removing them. I mean, seriously. Unfortunately, they still exist today. I won't link to them. They don't deserve any attention. Her heart must have further sunk when the Independent Police Complaints Commission cleared Essex Police of any wrongdoing in their handling of this case, specifically not acting on Lauren's call to them in December 2013. Lauren then set up the Breck Foundation, the link to which I'll put in the description. It's a really interesting website where you can volunteer or fundraise for the organisation and book a speaker to come to schools or churches to talk to children about internet safety. They also provide training for teachers on how to spot the signs of grooming. You can also donate, which I think, if you're looking for a cause to support, this would be a perfect organisation because the whole focus of them is to protect children. And as the stats say on the website, 99% of children went online in some form in 2021, and a third of children regularly play online games with strangers. I've signed up for a monthly donation, and there are various categories telling you what your donation can achieve. I have no affiliation with this foundation, and I'm just mentioning it genuinely because I think that organisations like this should be handed bags of money to continue their work, as it's clear not only that this foundation keeps Breck's memory alive, but his mother's sole focus now is to try and stop other mothers having to go through the agony that she had to go through. Breck, I'm sure, will be proud of her, and I sincerely hope that he is at peace. In December 1998, 21-year-old Lindsay Quay went missing from her home in Stamford Road, Southport, in Merseyside, UK, leaving behind her 2 children and her 23-year-old husband, Mitchell Quay. Quay, like any concerned husband, appealed to the press for help finding his wife, but his demeanour was off-putting and highly suspicious, for he took it a step further, basically inviting the press into his life. Here is an example of one of these interviews.
I haven't done anything to Lindsay. I'm not capable of doing something like that. Like I say, I'm not going to sit here and start saying yes and no to stupid things, stupid questions I've already answered 1,000 times.
And just say again, and it's not a stupid question, it's a very serious question. Did you kill Lindsay?
Wait and find out.
By the point of this interview, Mitchell Quay had strangled Lindsay to death, dismembered her, and scattered her remains in separate areas of Southport. This man is a manipulative, remorseless monster. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Lindsay Quay, formerly Lindsay Wilson, was born in 1977. The youngest of 6 children, she was described as beautiful, fun-loving, happy, and a caring person by those who knew her. When she was 17 years old, she became pregnant with her first serious boyfriend, but 5 months into the pregnancy, they separated. Soon after this, she met Mitchell Quay, a casino worker who promised to help her raise the child, and the pair soon became inseparable. They married quickly, within 5 weeks of beginning their relationship. This was a warning flag which we'll return to later. In 1995, Lindsay gave birth to her first child, a daughter called Robin, and in 1997, the couple had their first child together, a son called Jack. Outwardly, everything seemed ideal. Lindsay was a young mother with 2 beautiful children. However, Behind the scenes, in her short life, Lindsay was subjected to persistent violence and emotional abuse at the hands of her husband, a controlling, narcissistic coward who believed that he was smarter than everyone else. Heartbreakingly, after her death, a diary that Lindsay had written in since 1997 was uncovered, and this showed the depths of her despair and how unhappy she was. She dedicated this book to her children, and whilst we will never know, the content of the pages appears to indicate that she was leaving it for them, because she feared that her own life would soon come to an end. In the diary, she wrote, quote, "This book is for my kids, to let them know how hard my life was and how I tried my best to bring them up on my own, and let them know how much I love them." She also wrote, quote, "I hope you never have to go through anything that I had to go through. All I can say is, I've done my best. I hope it was good. One thing I've always done since the day you were born is make sure you knew I loved you. To my 2 babies." I've read reports which indicate repeated acts of violence within the family home. A neighbour recalled one occasion when Lindsay was 4 months pregnant with Jack, running down the road to get away from Kwai, who had assaulted her and then proceeded to smash up the property. It's clear that Kwai, as with other domestic abuse perpetrators, was a coward, a man who felt the need to achieve and maintain control over his wife. These individuals almost always have deep-seated fears of abandonment, and they feel that fear is the only way they can ensure their partner will not leave them, something they're unable to cope with. Between January 1998 and April 1998, Kwai left the family home on at least 7 occasions. On the last occasion, apparently for good. This led Lindsay to write in her diary, quote, "Mitch walked out, then came back." And on another occasion, she said, quote, "Gone, moved out again." Lastly, she wrote, quote, "So this time he's gone for good, have had it with him." Rather than leaving it to the end, I wish to explain why Kwai was acting in this way and give some context. One of an abuser's tools is withdrawing affection, where they withhold attention and caring in order to elicit a negative emotional response. A good example is ignoring their partner's phone calls or refusing to talk to them at home, etc. This is intended to make the victim feel worthless and agitated that, at any point, they could be abandoned, so they will often walk on eggshells, not wishing to displease their partner in case they leave them. This includes the perpetrator leaving the family home when they'll inevitably go to another property and sit there imagining how upset their partner must be. However, this is all a facade. These people are often emotionally dependent on the relationship and simply want the attention and the negative response. They want to see how devastated their victim is by their actions. They want them begging for them to come home because this makes them feel powerful and dominant in the relationship. Of course, as with all domestic abuse perpetrators, it's one rule for them and one rule for the victim. Of course, they feel they should be allowed to simply come and go from the relationship as they please, but if the victim tries to leave at any point, then God help them. Unfortunately, this was the case with Lindsay. In the summer of 1998, Lindsay was apparently free of Kwai and found a new home for herself and the children in Stamford Road. She managed to obtain this with the help of Women's Aid, an organisation that helps victims of domestic abuse. Lindsay was so afraid of Kwai and what he might do to her that she was given a public protection alarm which she could activate and the police would descend on the property. However, soon after moving into her new home, Kwai started worming his way back in. Remember, this was never actually about leaving the relationship. He wanted her to see how important he was to her by withdrawing his affection. However, I think that he saw that Lindsay was doing things on her own, moving on with her life, and he couldn't allow this, and he needed to be back in order to control her. Kwai was living with his wife and the 2 children in December 1998. On December the 15th, 1998, Lindsay was seen alive for the last time. She then disappeared. Despite Lindsay going missing in December 1998, her loving husband did not report her missing straight away. In fact, he'd never reported her missing at all. It was only in February 1999, over 50 days since her disappearance, that a concerned social worker for the children raised the alarm, due to not having seen Lindsay for some time. When the police eventually spoke to Kwai, he had no explanation as to why he'd never reported his wife missing, with him claiming that he just assumed that she'd up and left one day, Whilst Lindsay may have left him, the police struggled to believe that she would have left her 2 children without a word before Christmas. Lindsay's family also could not believe it, and they knew Quai was lying. They had no doubt that Quai had hurt Lindsay, but it was a case of proving it. However, Quai, being the narcissist that he is, couldn't simply put his head down and get on with his life. Instead, he craved the media's attention. He went on morning television to make an appeal for his wife, and even invited journalists and a documentary film crew to follow him around. Everyone who came into contact with Quai was suspicious. He seemed to show no negative emotions when talking about the disappearance of his wife, the mother of his children, and instead seemed jovial, without a care in the world, with him later being dubbed the, quote, smiling killer. Quai obviously thought he was very clever, but the police knew almost immediately that he was the killer. Remember, the police had information which was not available to the public, including calls to 999 about the various reports of domestic violence that Lindsay had been subjected to. They'd also spoken to her friends and family, all of whom pointed the finger directly at Quai. In early February 1999, Quai made a claim that he'd seen Lindsay locally in the market and in a BMW being driven along. The police checked and found no evidence of this. However, what they did uncover was that since his wife's disappearance, Quai had been forging her signature in a benefits book so he could withdraw her money. On February the 27th, 1999, he was arrested on suspicion of murder and fraud. The police didn't have enough evidence to charge Quai with murder, but charged him with fraud, and he was convicted and given community service. I think the police were trying to psychologically intimidate Quai, showing him they knew he had done it and were not going away, and that it was only a matter of time. A terrible part of this story is Lindsay's family having to continue to interact with Quai on a regular basis because of the grandchildren. For 18 months, Lindsay's parents, including her father Peter Wilson, who made his feelings about Quai clear, had to knock on the door of the man they knew killed their daughter at the home where she'd likely been murdered in order to collect the grandchildren. Quai claimed that when the truth was revealed and he was exonerated, that Peter would owe him an apology. Quai was reveling in the attention he was getting and using any opportunity to spin his web of lies, trying to portray himself as the victim, the concerned husband who had been abandoned by his wife, who was being persecuted by society. However, the attention always had to be on Quai's terms, and after a year of being in the spotlight, Quai was apparently sick of all the attention and so gave an interview, which was published in the papers, stating he no longer wanted the attention of the press. So, you have a man being followed around by a documentary film crew who's so sick of the media attention that he had to go to the papers to tell them to stop publishing stories about him. Clearly, the opposite is true. I believe that, after 12 months, Quai was not getting the attention he was craving, and so had to reignite attention by claiming that he didn't want any further press coverage. I'm sure he was hoping that, by saying, "Don't look at me," people would be more fascinated and feel compelled to pay him more attention. Quai's particular nemesis in the police was Detective Superintendent Jeff Sloan, who stated, quote, "He almost goaded me by going to the media. I just felt he was an egotist in exploiting the situation. He started to revel in his own notoriety." Quai would antagonize the police, including sending DS Sloan a Christmas card with a bottle of hair dye with a note stating he should, quote, "get rid of the grey bits to have more confidence." We're all human beings, and if someone pisses us off, we naturally will expel more energy to try and bring that person down if we know they're ultimately in the wrong. Antagonizing a senior police officer who knows your secret and who has the whole weight of the police force behind them is not a smart move. This shows the complete delusion and narcissism of Mitchell Quai, believing he was so clever that he could stick 2 fingers up at the authorities and they would not come after him. He was wrong. The walls were closing in on Quai, and this clip appears to be his last interview before his downfall, where again, he is the victim, and he wishes the viewer to see that front and centre. The police have been working on this case for 18 months, convinced that Lindsay was dead, and, although they didn't have a body, they were able to show there had been no activity on her bank accounts, she had not kept any other appointments, and no one, aside from her husband, had apparently seen her since December 1998. In addition to this, They had records of his apparent violent behaviour towards her and statements from her friends and family that outlined the same. They also had nothing from their inquiries which would give any indication that Lindsay would have ever left her children. In addition, the police found out that, on the day she was last seen alive, the 15th of December 1998, Lindsay had spoken to friends about meeting with a solicitor to finally divorce her husband. There was likely more information the police had, but I cannot find specific reference to it. I do know that they searched the family home, so potentially they found forensic evidence. Regardless, on the 7th of June 2000, 18 months after Lindsay went missing, Mitchell Quire was arrested on suspicion of murder. He gave no information during interview, but this didn't matter. The circumstantial case was enough to charge him with the murder of his wife Lindsay. However, being charged seemed to open the floodgates, and Mitchell Quire confessed to killing his wife. Based on his confession and evidence collected by the police, they were able to determine what had become of Lindsay Quire. Specifically, it appears that in the early hours of December 16, 1998, Lindsay informed Quire that she was leaving him. They had an argument, and Quire grabbed Lindsay round the neck and strangled her to death on the living room floor. This was while both children were in the house, lightly asleep in their beds. Afterwards, Quire placed Lindsay's body in their bedroom and closed the door, placing towels at the foot of the door to stop the smell of decomposition. How long Lindsay remained in the bedroom is unclear, but it's apparent that Quire carried on as if everything was normal, taking the children to school, feeding them, and playing with them in the house where their mother was lying dead. However, Quire knew that he needed to dispose of Lindsay and employed the help of his brother, Elliot Quire, aged 22 years old at the time, and who was employed as a butcher. Within the bathroom, the Quire brothers cut up Lindsay's body, removing her arms and legs, as well as her head and hands. Her body parts were then deposited around various sites in Southport, with her torso being dumped near a roller coaster at Southport Pleasureland. Her arms and legs were found dumped in a bush near a railway line. Her head and hands were disposed of in a landfill, but unfortunately were never recovered by the police. On June the 9th, 2000, Quire agreed to show the police where Lindsay's remains had been deposited. On the 16th of January 2001, Mitchell Quire appeared for sentence at Liverpool Crown Court before Justice Brian Leveson QC, having pled guilty to the murder of Lindsay Quire. This was clearly a calculated move by Quire, as he'd agreed to plead guilty to manslaughter, i.e. admitting that he killed Lindsay, but claiming that it was an accident. However, this was rejected. I've no doubt his guilty plea was to get some credit from the court for his sentencing. Justice Leveson described Quire as, quote, an evil cynic, and stated, quote, you killed your wife as long ago as December the 16th, 1998, in circumstances which I accept were not premeditated. What followed, however, was very different. Over the next 18 months, you embarked on a deception of breathtaking cynicism, appearing on the television and radio, bemoaning your wife's absence and castigating police for directing their attention towards you. He then sentenced him. Mitchell Quire was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum tariff of 17 years for the murder of his wife Lindsay. His brother Elliot Quire was sentenced to 7 years for dismembering and helping to dispose of Lindsay's remains. Mitchell Quire appeared to show no remorse for his behaviour whilst he was in prison and was still obsessed with himself. Psychiatric nurse Chris Keneally worked at the same prison as Quire and stated that he was, quote, one of the most unpleasant psychopaths he'd ever met. Chris stated that Quire would become excited when his image appeared on television and would ask staff whether they'd seen his various appearances. Chris said, quote, he seemed very disappointed. He expected that everyone in the prison would now recognise his star status, and he also expected to be treated as the celebrity that he felt he was. He was very upset that this did not happen. Quire first became eligible for parole in 2017, and this was denied. Lindsay's daughter Robin released a statement after this decision, which read, quote, it makes me feel a lot safer knowing he won't be getting out, and it's a little bit of justice for my mum. although nothing that ever happens will be enough justice. There's not much more to say, other than we are happy we can relax for a while and not constantly have it at the back of our minds. Quai again applied for parole in May 2022, but this was again refused by the parole board, who had ongoing concerns about his risk and him taking drugs in prison. The decision letter from the parole board stated, "Some concerns have also emerged about his conduct in relationships with friends, professional staff and other prisoners. Reports gave examples of instances where he'd acted on grievances and been aggressive towards others. There were also some concerns about his involvement with drugs in the prison. Professional staff have identified the need for further interventions to address Mr. Quai's risk in relationships and the risk of violence if he became preoccupied with a specific problem, struggled to deal with it, and still lacked the capacity to be in full control of his emotions." So, Mitchell Quai, now aged in his mid-40s, remains in prison, having served 22 years so far. The knockback from the parole board in 2022 means he's likely to have another hearing in 2024. The outcome of this hearing will inevitably be publicised, but it seems that the parole board still have significant concerns about this man and its risk of violence, so he's likely years from release. I keep returning to the issue of domestic abuse, and I make no apology for this, as it's insidious and one of the worst types of offences I've come across, given how underreported it is, its persistence, the profound psychological and emotional impact it has on its victims, but also the often fatal consequences of this type of behaviour. As I've said in a previous video, 2 women a week in the UK are murdered, either by a partner or a former partner. This is over 100 a year. In the US, this number is around 70 a month, so approximately 840 women a year, which is a staggering number. This is not to forget men who are killed by their female partners, but the opposite dynamic is obviously more common. During each of these videos on domestic abuse perpetrators, I hope to give a little more insight and understanding to their behaviours, warning signs, and also give advice. With regards to the template I've spoken about before, domestic abuse perpetrators almost always have significant issues with abandonment and self-esteem, with them feeling that, because of how they perceive themselves, they will inevitably be abandoned, something they cannot cope with, and so they seek to control their partner to ensure that this does not happen. This includes physical and non-physical actions, which are used to gain and maintain control over their victim. A common exhibited behaviour is violence, with this being used to put the victim in fear if they defy the perpetrator's authority, demonstrating to them who is in charge, making them feel powerful. However, there are also emotional and psychological methods, and this includes, as already stated in the case of Mitchell Quai, withdrawing affection, which can include ignoring the victim, threatening to leave them, or actually leaving them. This is intended to cause the victim emotional distress by making them feel abandoned, and therefore, when this affection is given, it's usually with certain conditions, with the victim having to act in a certain way. This, though, is just a pantomime. The perpetrator relies on the relationship, and everything they do is to make sure they are not abandoned. There is an horrific hypocrisy in the behaviour of domestic abuse perpetrators. They feel they can act in any manner they want, but if their victim does anything they don't like, even something they themselves have done, they will be punished. In the case of Quai, even though he'd repeatedly left the family home and abandoned Lindsay and the children, when she dared to try and divorce him, he would not accept this, and I've no doubt he killed her as a way to exert ultimate control over her by taking her life, ensuring that she would not leave him and be with anyone else. Domestic abuse perpetrators tend to consider their victims as objects, which they can use any way they want. This is not to say they don't care about them on some level, but their needs and wants take priority. However, Mitchell Quai is not one of these people. He's clearly a man who saw Lindsay as nothing more than his possession, with him referring to her body as a, quote, carcass. In addition, his demeanour through all the interviews is not that of a grieving husband. He's smiling and joking. He has no empathy or concern for what he's done, including the fact that he's robbed 2 children of a mother. Mitchell Quai is clearly a predator. I think this was shown initially in the relationship with Lindsay, which brings us to our first learning point. Specifically, domestic abuse perpetrators will often form relationships with people who they believe are vulnerable in some way and therefore more easy to manipulate and control. With Lindsay, she was very young, aged only 17, 5 months pregnant, and her partner had just broken up with her. I believe that Quai saw an opportunity and swooped in like a knight in shining armour, apparently saving Lindsay from having to go through raising a child on her own. They got married in 5 weeks, and this is a massive warning sign. Domestic abuse perpetrators will often progress relationships extremely quickly in order to make it more difficult for their victim to leave and also to place themselves in a position where they can more easily control them. This can include moving in with a partner quickly, getting them pregnant quickly, as well as getting engaged or married soon after the relationship has started. All of these tactics, in the perpetrator's mind, strengthens the link between the pair, with them believing that if they're living together, or a man and wife, or have children together, their abuse is more likely to be tolerated and their victim will not be able to extricate themselves quickly from the situation. Unfortunately, it is all too common for perpetrators to use these same things to maintain control and punish their victim if the relationship does come to an end, including using child contact to monitor their former partner and potentially turning the children against their mother. Mitchell Quai's complete lack of regard for anyone but himself is not only shown by the murder, but his behaviour afterwards. It's clear that he filled the deep, dark hole of insecurity inside of him by using the media to get himself attention. There was no concern about being caught, but instead it was about manipulating others to give him sympathy. Poor little Mitchell. Your wife has gone missing, but of course you are the real victim. The fact that this need for attention extended to him wanting the media to see him, whilst he was directing the police to his wife's remains, in my opinion is indicative of his underlying psychopathy, with him having no conscience, no remorse. It's clear that Mitchell Quai wanted attention whatever way he could, whether this was as the innocent persecuted victim or the vicious cold-blooded killer. It was all the same to him. Perhaps this cold lack of any sort of conscience is what the parole board detected and which is stopping him from being released. However, regardless, the end of this video should not be about Mitchell Quai. It should be about the beautiful young woman whose life he cruelly snatched away, and the 2 children who had to grow up without their mother. It's also about Lindsay's family, who had to wait so long for justice for their daughter, and, given the condition of her body, were not able to say goodbye properly. In a heartbreaking postscript, Lindsay's brother, Peter Wilson, committed suicide soon after Quai's imprisonment in 2001. He was just 24 years old. The coroner's inquest showed that he'd taken his life because he struggled to come to terms with the death of his sister and was unable to process his grief. I hope both he and Lindsay are at peace and that the family, including her children, have been able to move on from the horror inflicted on them. Reynard Sanaga is the most prolific convicted rapist in UK criminal history, with him estimated to have raped and sexually assaulted at least 200 men between 2015 and 2017. Sanaga would stalk the streets of Manchester, UK, looking for victims who he would lure into his property and then assault them, with him filming his sickening crimes. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Reynard Sanaga was born on the 19th of February 1983 in Jambi, on the island of Sumatra, Indonesia. He was from a privileged upbringing, with his father being involved in banking. The family were wealthy, and Sanaga grew up not wanting for anything. Sanaga was raised Catholic and appears to have hidden the fact that he was gay from his parents, who wanted him to marry a woman and settle down and start a family. After completing a degree in architecture at the University of Indonesia in 2006, Sanaga moved to the UK in 2007 to begin to study for a master's degree in planning at the University of Manchester, which he completed in 2009, followed by him studying for a Master of Arts in Sociology, which he achieved in 2011. He then remained living in Manchester, and in 2012 he began to study for his doctorate degree in Human Geography, with him working on his thesis at the time of his arrest in 2017. During his time in the UK, Sanaga lived openly as a gay man and was sexually promiscuous. He would, however, changed completely when his parents came to visit or when he would return home to Indonesia, with them apparently having no idea of his sexual orientation until his trial. Sanaga's base for his attacks was a flat in Princes Street, Manchester, right in the heart of the city and at the centre of the nightlife. His road was somewhere that people staggering home from a night out would pass by. People who met Sanaga saw an unassuming, 5'7", bespectacled, thin man. His social media presence showed the face he wished to portray to others. There were people who identified issues with him, which we'll return to later, but everyone who knew him was shocked by the monster he truly was. This would only be revealed in 2017, when its rampage was finally brought to an end by the police. In order to outline the horror in this case, it's necessary to start at the end and see how the offences of Sanaga came to light, which began with one phone call to the police on the 2nd of June 2017. On this date, the police received a phone call from a 21-year-old rugby player who stated that Sanaga had tried to rape him. This man said that he'd been on his way home from a night out when Sanaga had ushered him into his property. In his intoxicated state, the man agreed. Sanaga then tried to drug this man and was trying to rape him when he woke up, and he managed to fight him off. Sanaga was no match for a rugby player and, to put it mildly, he had the shit kicked out of him. The police attended and found Sanaga barely conscious on the floor, and initially they arrested the rugby player for causing grievous bodily harm, but they were suspicious of Sanaga and accompanied him to the hospital where he was chained to the bed. They seized his mobile phone from the property and demanded the PIN number from him. Sanaga initially gave the wrong PIN number, but eventually gave the right one, and the police officers were confronted with the video of Sanaga attacking the rugby player, which showed, unfortunately, that this individual had already been raped before he came to. Sanaga was arrested in the hospital bed for a single count of rape, but this was just the tip of the iceberg. Police returned to Sanaga's property and recovered dozens of phones, driving licenses, student IDs, wallets, watches, and Facebook screen grabs of men. All of these men were those that Sanaga had raped, and these were his trophies of his crimes. The true horror, though, was found on the phone the police had taken initially, and on this phone was hundreds of hours of Sanaga raping and sexually assaulting men. Sanaga anally raped almost all of his victims and would ejaculate both inside them and on their bodies. He used a condom during only one of his attacks, and, by some miracle, is not known to have infected any of his victims. This is based on the fact that he tested negative for all sexually transmitted diseases upon his arrest. This of course doesn't discount that he previously had an STD and then got it treated. He would also kiss his victims' bodies and on their mouths. Most of his victims were raped repeatedly over a number of hours. I feel sorry for the police officers who had to watch each and every one of these sickening videos. CCTV analysis and inquiries showed Sanaga's modus operandi, with him leaving his property late at night and trawling the local streets looking for lone, intoxicated men, who he then manipulated into coming back to his flat. This was by a number of ways, including giving them a safe space to sleep off their intoxication, ordering a taxi, or inviting them back to his flat for more drinks. Unfortunately, when we're drunk, we make bad decisions, and in this state, it may have seemed like a good idea to go with this unassuming, physically slight man for whatever reasons. This CCTV footage shows Sanaga going on the prowl for a victim. When they got into the flat, Sanaga would offer them a drink, spiked with the drug gamma hydroxybutyric acid, more commonly known as GHB. GHB is a drug actually used to treat sleep disorders and anxiety, and it acts by relaxing the nervous system. However, in large enough doses, it can cause unconsciousness, confusion, and memory loss. When the men were unconscious, Sanaga would rape them, filming his sickening crimes, clearly for his own sexual gratification at a later date. Police inquiries established that the first attack they could prove was on New Year's Day 2015, when a man was out for a night out, and the next thing he remembered was coming to, covered in vomit in Sanaga's flat, with no idea how he got there. Sanaga feigned concern and gave some story about this victim being too drunk to get home, and he gave him a place to stay. The victim actually apologized to Sanaga and went on his way, not knowing until 2 years later that he had been raped. Sanaga's thoughts would prowl the streets most nights and committed several rapes per month. The police had the heartbreaking task of informing the victims of his offences. Using Sanaga's trophies and the content of the videos, they were able to identify 48 victims who they had to contact individually and inform them that they had been raped. Almost all of them had no idea that anything had happened to them, and the bottom of their world must have dropped out. However, at least 60 victims could not be identified. Forensic analysis and detailed police work led to Sanaga being suspected of raping at least 206 men between January 2015 and his arrest in 2017. Let that number sink in. At least 206 men raped by this man in a 2.5-year period. Sanaga's method did not change, and he simply gave some sort of excuse when these people woke up to explain their presence in his flat, with him knowing full well they couldn't actually remember the true horror of their experience. Some people may be questioning why no one reported his behaviour to the police or suspected they had been raped. The unfortunate truth is that I believe that some of them probably did suspect they'd been raped, but there's such a stigma about male sexual assault that they probably felt so ashamed, so violated and so dirty that they didn't want to admit to themselves or others what had happened. However, as will be illustrated later, a lot of his victims showed extraordinary bravery later on in court. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, Sanaga pleaded not guilty to all charges, and there were 4 trials. Between the 1st of June 2018 and the 10th of July 2018, for crimes against 13 victims. Between the 1st of April 2019 and the 7th of May 2019, for crimes against 12 victims. Between the 16th of September 2019 and the 4th of October 2019, related to 10 victims. And finally, in December 2019, for offences related to a further 13 victims. The callousness of Sanaga was fully on display through each and every one of these hearings. He forced his victims to have to relive their ordeals, and the videos of the attacks were played in court. Sanaga appeared to be enjoying the trials, smirking throughout, and taking great pleasure in watching the videos of his attacks. The bravery of the victims has to be noted, as many of them testified in court and refused to do so behind screens, with them wishing to look Sanaga directly in the eyes. Other elements of Sanaga's depravity were fully exposed, including him sending friend requests to many of his victims on Facebook after the attacks, and the meticulous way that he collected trophies and documented his crimes. Sanaga would also boast to his friends about his sexual exploits, subtly admitting his crimes, with him saying that he would use a, quote, secret potion when having sex with men. Sanaga's defense was pathetic, with him claiming that all of his victims were consensual sexual partners, despite almost all of them being heterosexual and them obviously being unconscious in the videos. Some of the victims were heard snoring in the clips that were shown to the court. To no one's surprise, Sanaga was found guilty in all 4 trials and was eventually convicted of crimes against 48 victims, including 136 counts of rape, 14 counts of sexual assault, 8 counts of attempted rape, and 1 count of assault by penetration. Sanaga was sentenced at the conclusion of each trial, but I want to focus on the sentence from his last trial in December 2019, which occurred on January the 6th, 2020, in front of Judge Suzanne Goddard KC. She stated, quote, "You are a man of some intelligence and cunning who has tried to counter each and every twist in the prosecution case as you gave evidence, hopeless though your efforts were. You showed no shame or remorse as the jury had to view hours of the most intimate footage. Your actions show you are a dangerous, deeply disturbed and perverted individual with no sense of reality. You described yourself as having behaved tenderly to the males who fell into your clutches. Nothing could be further from the truth. All of your actions were cold and calculated to avoid the males waking up during sex. You persisted in your denials of guilt in spite of the overwhelming nature of the evidence against you and the previous jury verdicts. You gave no thought to the deep distress and lasting psychological damage you will have caused these young men." Reference was also made to a probation pre-sentence report, where the author wrote, quote, "I am unable to conclude that Mr. Sanaga is anything other than extremely dangerous. His level of denial and the additional trials that are pending make it unlikely that the prison or probation service will make any progress with him in the foreseeable future." The judge then sentenced him. Reynard Sanaga was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum tariff of 30 years in prison before he's able to apply for parole. This was then increased to 40 years at the Court of Appeal on the 11th of December 2020. This means Sanaga's earliest release date is 2060, when it will be 77 years of age. Given the level of danger he poses and his remorselessness, I think there's a strong likelihood that this man will spend the rest of his life behind bars. One of the senior police officers who led the investigation described Sanaga as, quote, "a psychopath," and added, quote, "Had he not been a narcissist and a psychopath, anyone else faced with such damning evidence would have admitted to what they've done." I would agree with this wholeheartedly, and there are elements of Sanaga's personality noted by friends which give an idea of the sort of man he was. He was deeply self-absorbed, obsessed with his own physical appearance and his importance to the world in general. One of his former housemates claimed that they actually had an argument with Sanaga because he was convinced that if he died, all life would come to an end. He couldn't seem to imagine the world continuing without him due to how important he was. He was an extreme narcissist. I believe that Sanaga is a man without any conscience or any remorse. Everyone in the world is there for him, and he can use and abuse as much as he wants. I think that he sees no problem with raping these men. They were there for his pleasure, and their level of consent and the horrific emotional and psychological harm his actions caused were secondary to him getting his needs met. Potentially his self-entitled attitudes and beliefs stem from his privileged upbringing. Sanaga primarily targeted heterosexual men, and I think this gave him a thrill, but also enabled him to further degrade them, with him believing that these straight males would be especially traumatized if they found out they were raped by a man. I think that Sanaga pleaded not guilty in order to be the center of attention and to relive his crimes over and over again. This man is an absolute monster. Police believe that Sanaga began sexually assaulting men as far back as 2005, when he was in Indonesia, and I have little doubt that the 206 victims he created in the UK is likely just a small proportion of the true number of people he violated in both countries. It is possible that Reynard Sanaga is the most prolific rapist not only in the UK, but potentially in the world. Hopefully he will never be released. Joanna Dennehy is a British serial killer who, in the space of just 10 days in March 2013, stabbed 3 men to death, and tried to murder 2 others before she was stopped. She later said she had planned to kill 9 men in total. He is one of only 2 women currently serving prison sentences in the UK who will never be released, the other being Rose West, who, along with her husband Fred, murdered at least 10 young women between 1973 and 1987 in Gloucester. The reason why Joanna Dennehy will spend the rest of her life in prison is the nature of her crimes, her lack of remorse, and her narcissism, with her describing herself as, quote, a fully committed psychopath. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Joanna Christine Dennehy was born in August 1982 and grew up near the city of St Albans in Hertfordshire. She was raised by her mother Kathleen, her father Kevin, and she also had a sister Maria. I've looked into various reports and articles and can find no evidence of neglect or abuse in her childhood. In fact, it appears that Dennehy was raised in a loving and stable home. She did well at primary school and seemed to have a promising future, and she showed interest in becoming a lawyer. However, all that changed when Dennehy became a teenager and she began to rebel, and this included drinking alcohol and taking drugs in the company of criminals. Despite attempts by her parents to boundary her behaviour, Dennehy would run away from home, and she did this on at least 8 occasions between the ages of 15 and 16 years old. She would spend her time drinking and taking drugs with her negative peers and engaging in sexual activity with adult men and women. At around the age of 16, Dennehy met 21-year-old John Trainer whilst he was out walking his dog, and the pair began a volatile on-off relationship which lasted for the next 12 years. The pair had 2 daughters, including Cheyenne, who was born in 1999 when Dennehy was aged 17. Cheyenne later described happy memories of her mother initially, before her life descended into chaos, with her stating during an interview in 2019 that she recalled, quote, "My mum would love to read. She was always on the sofa reading a book, and she would go out on long walks. She loved Mr. Darcy. She read Pride and Prejudice. She would talk to me about it all the time. She'd do papier-mâché art with me and my friends." However, Cheyenne was also witness to the change in her mother, as she became an alcoholic and addicted to drugs, with her recounting, quote, "She'd gone out drinking. In the middle of the night, she sent a man to beat up my dad. It was terrifying. I was about 5, and I'd woken up, and I heard this shouting. There was this man outside shouting at my dad. He said, 'Joe has sent me here because you've done this,' but I didn't know what. My dad shouted at me to go back to bed, so I did. I didn't know what had happened after that, but I was petrified. My mum would just come home after being away for so long, and she'd have a black eye from a fight. She'd disappear for days on end, sometimes for months. She would come home, and she would have cuts all over her, or she'd been cheating, and she'd have love bites. She'd have to hide it with a scarf." As time progressed, Dennehy showed complete indifference to the welfare of her children and would leave John to raise them. John later stated that he was fearful of Dennehy's volatility, with her regularly cutting herself across the stomach in front of him, and she would often sit at the breakfast table drinking spirits. Dennehy would regularly carry knives, and he recalled one occasion in 2009 when she returned home drunk, pulled a knife out of her boot, and plunged it into the living room floor, yelling, quote, "I wish I could kill someone." Soon afterwards, John took the children and fled, with them having no contact with Dennehy until they saw the news articles about her crime spree. Prior to the murders, Dennehy was known to the police and had served time in prison for burglary. In 2012, the year before the murders, she was arrested for theft and had a psychological assessment. She was diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder as well as underlying psychopathic traits. She was described as a woman who was manipulative, lacking in any remorse for her behaviour, and prone to rage, impulsivity, violence, and explosive outbursts of anger. Dennehy was prescribed antipsychotic medication to try and manage her mental health issues. Before getting to the murders themselves, it's necessary to look at Dennehy's accomplices and her apparent allure to men in her life. 3 men eventually appeared at the dock with Dennehy when she was eventually sentenced, but I wish to focus on the main 2. Firstly, Gary Stretch, formerly Gary Richards, a hulking 7'3" man who was apparently besotted with Dennehy, and, as will be returned to later, even whilst awaiting his fate, still professed his undying love and devotion to her. He was a man with below-average intelligence and a long criminal record of offences motivated by money, including burglaries and robberies, and he seemed to be a man without any real purpose in life, who, at the age of 47, was living in dilapidated accommodation and had little real stake in society. The other man, 37-year-old Leslie Layton, didn't have a long criminal record, but was similarly rudderless in life and was enamoured with Dennehy. At the eventual court case, it was pointed out that both men were two of many individuals who Dennehy had under her spell. It's not explicitly stated why this was the case, but it appears that Dennehy would target disenfranchised and often vulnerable individuals who existed on the fringes of society. She paid attention to them, which I think made them feel special, and the superficial charm associated with her psychopathy likely made them think she genuinely had feelings for them. It appears that sex was a particular weapon in her arsenal, with her sleeping with men to form connections with them. It seems that these men found being around Dennehy exciting, with them reveling in her behaviour, and eventually, her infamy. However, any outward expressions of attention or affection were Dennehy's way of manipulating those around her, including these men, in order to obtain drink, drugs, accommodation, and eventually to have accomplices in her killing spree. In January 2013, Dennehy, by this point aged 30, met 48-year-old Kevin Lee in the town of Peterborough in the county of Cambridgeshire. Kevin rented out cheap rooms to vulnerable people, and the two soon began a sexual relationship. Dennehy was able to live rent-free and acted as Kevin's, quote, enforcer, threatening people who had not paid their rent and other debts. So you have Dennehy in an environment where she could manipulate and abuse. With Kevin Lee, she used sex as a way to get what she wanted, in this case a roof over her head. She spun him lies to gain his sympathy, including claiming that she'd been abused as a child by her father and she'd eventually murdered him. None of this is true. With regards to her role as an enforcer, I've no doubt that Dennehy enjoyed victimising and abusing vulnerable people, likely finding the terror she instilled in them exhilarating. It was also around this time that Dennehy stopped taking her antipsychotic medication. Joanna Dennehy's first victim was Lukasz Slabozewski, a 31-year-old Polish national who had issues with drink and drugs and who lived close to Dennehy. How and where the two met is unclear, but it's believed that Dennehy only knew Lukasz for a matter of days before murdering him. However, even during this short time, he was clearly smitten, as he had texted a friend of his about his, quote, English girlfriend. On or around the 19th of March 2013, it's believed that Lukasz was lured to Dennehy's property with the promise of sex, and when he stepped in, was attacked. He was killed with a single stab wound to the heart. Dennehy then, treating this man's remains as garbage, put his body in a wheelie bin whilst figuring out what to do with him. However, Dennehy could not contain her excitement and glee about what she'd done, so Dennehy invited a 14-year-old girl she knew to the property, specifically to show her Lukasz's body in the wheelie bin. Dennehy then borrowed money from Kevin Lee and purchased a Vauxhall Astra and travelled by taxi with Gary Stretch to collect it. This was around the 21st of March 2013. The pair then drove around Peterborough with Lukasz's body in the boot and eventually dumped it off Thorney Dyke, a rural road which was near to where Stretch had lived some years before. The second victim was John Chapman, a 56-year-old vulnerable man who was a housemate of Dennehy's. Chapman was a man who'd served his country in the Royal Navy, but his life had deteriorated due to his issues with alcohol and he'd fallen on hard times. However, he was described as a, quote, kindly, harmless and inoffensive man, and Joanna Dennehy took full advantage of this. In the days before his murder, Dennehy, Gary Stretch and Leslie Layton were drinking his property. However, it seems there was an issue with John's tenancy, and he'd been served with an eviction notice, and it was Dennehy's job to get him out, She bragged to others she would do this by any means possible. John Chapman is believed to have been murdered in the early hours of the 29th of March 2013, whilst asleep in his living room. His blood alcohol level was 5 times the legal limit, so he was likely almost unconscious. He then attacked John and stabbed him once in the neck, severing his carotid artery, and 5 times in the chest, with 2 of these stab wounds passing through his heart. All of the wounds were delivered with considerable force. There were no defensive injuries on John's body, indicating that he likely died almost instantly, and thankfully had little idea what was going on. Dennehy then used John's mobile phone to call Gary Stretch to tell him what she had done. She also called Leslie Layton, who, rather than being horrified when he saw the scene in front of him, decided to take a photograph of John's dead body. Dennehy then went out shopping with a friend, without a care in the world, leaving John Chapman's body lying on his floor. The third murder was that of Kevin Lee, the man who'd taken Joanna Dennehy in. Why he was killed is unclear, but it seems likely he was just a convenient victim to be able to satisfy Dennehy's ever-growing bloodlust. He too was killed on the 29th of March 2013. He was lured to the property with suggestive text messages promising him sex, which he discussed just an hour before going to her property with a friend. When he went to Dennehy's property, she attacked him, stabbing him 5 times in the chest, with his injuries piercing his heart and lungs. Kevin was found to have defensive wounds, which indicated that he fought for his life. Joanna Dennehy now had 2 dead bodies to deal with at 2 different locations, and employed the help of both Layton and Stretch, who dutifully worked to help Dennehy clean up the murder scenes and dispose of the bodies. John Chapman's body was driven and dumped mere yards from the body of Lukas Slapaszewski, which has still not been discovered. Kevin Lee's remains were dumped in a remote rural area on the outskirts of Peterborough, called Newborough. However, Dennehy could not resist the temptation to further degrade Kevin, as if killing him was not bad enough. She dressed his corpse in a sequin dress of hers, then he was dumped wearing this, with his body being posed so that his buttocks were exposed. Dennehy took great delight, not only in killing the man who'd given her a place to live, but humiliating him even in death. She told People about the murder and was described as ecstatic. Joanna Dennehy and Gary Stretch appeared to have been under no illusions that they would eventually get caught and likely spend years, if not the rest of their lives, behind bars. But they were completely indifferent to this, with Stretch apparently laughing at this knowledge and stating, quote, "My kids are grown up, so I don't care." Joanna Dennehy and Gary Stretch then went on the run in order to get a head start on the police, and on the 2nd of April 2013, they travelled to Hereford in Hertfordshire, approximately 140 miles away from Peterborough, an area that Stretch had previously lived in. However, it's clear they had no intention of lying low and were looking to terrorise people in a whole new county. The pair committed burglaries in quick succession, and somewhere along the journey, Stretch was apparently acquired a handgun, which he proudly displayed to criminals they met up with in the Hereford area, looking for ways to sell their ill-gotten gains. This CCTV footage shows Dennehy and Stretch wandering around a supermarket hand in hand. This footage shows the sheer size of Gary Stretch, who, as already stated, was 7'3" tall, and potentially he was armed at this point. I find footage like this so strange. You have people just going about their day-to-day life, not knowing they're walking past a woman who had murdered 3 people. Makes you think who you may pass on the street today, doesn't it? Anyway, on the 3rd of April 2013, just 24 hours after they arrived in Hereford, Dennehy had decided she wished to kill again, and she and Stretch began cruising around the roads looking for targets. This CCTV footage is chilling, as it shows Dennehy in a shop on the same road as her first random victim, with her appearing, as it was described in court later, in a state of euphoria. Approximately a minute after Dennehy left this store, she came across 63-year-old Robert Buriza, a complete stranger to her. He was a retired fireman who was out walking his dogs. Dennehy approached him from behind, pulled out a large knife and stabbed Robin in the back, and then a second time in the right arm. Robin spun round and asked Dennehy why she was doing this, with her responding, quote, "I want to hurt you. I'm going to fucking kill you." Dennehy tried to continue to attack Robin, but he fought back, and eventually she stopped the attack and climbed back into the car with Stretch, and the pair drove away. Dennehy was apparently unsatisfied with this attack and demanded that Stretch find her another victim. Using his local knowledge, Stretch parked the car near a pathway frequented by dog walkers, and they soon saw 56-year-old John Rogers walking his dog. This second attack was less than 30 minutes after the first incident, and Dennehy was determined that this man would die. Again, she approached John from behind and began to stab him repeatedly in the back. When he turned round, she repeatedly stabbed him in the stomach and chest area. When he fell, Dennehy continued to stab him repeatedly while he lay helpless on the floor. This was a frenzied and ferocious attack, during which time Dennehy stabbed John Rogers approximately 35 to 40 times. John received deep wounds to his chest, abdomen and back. Both lungs collapsed, his bowels were perforated and exposed out of his body, and he received wounds to his hands, which caused severe nerve damage. John was found by a member of the public who called the police and an ambulance, and he was rushed to hospital, and by some miracle, he survived. However, in a cruel footnote, John Rogers passed away in November 2014, just 18 months after the attack. The police did not pursue additional charges for Dennehy for his murder, which I find odd. Sometimes in the UK, if someone later dies from an attack, then the offender could be charged with murder even years later if their death was linked to the injuries from the initial assault. I'd be surprised if the attack that John suffered did not have something to do with his death. Perhaps the police couldn't make a definitive link. Regardless, in my mind, Joanna Dennehy killed 4, not 3 people. Within minutes of stabbing John Rogers, the police apprehended Stretch and Dennehy, as all forces were already looking out for them for the murder of Kevin Lee, whose body had been found, but they were now linked to these 2 stabbings. Dennehy was taken to a police station, and this chilling footage shows her apparent indifference to her fate while she flirted with police officers.
Let's go. My name is Mern. Stand up for say. I need to like a take. Signature from beautiful buggy fox. Like that one waffle. A change in minor and marrying you better sleep conversation of attempted murder and
I think this clip shows 2 things. Firstly, the complete lack of remorse or concern from Dennehy, with her acting like she's just been arrested for shoplifting, rather than the attempted murder of 2 people and the murder of 1 other, with her knowing that they would soon link her to a further 2. Also, I think it shows Dennehy's arrogance, manipulation and narcissism, with her default way of acting in any environment being a way to look to manipulate those around her to get what she wants, and she believes that, in this environment, somehow her fluttering her eyelids will get her special treatment. Dennehy was described as, quote, calm and cooperative during her police interview, but she gave little information. However, regardless of this, there was sufficient evidence to charge her with 3 counts of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. Gary Stretch and Leslie Latham were both charged with crimes related to assisting Joanna Dennehy in her offences. Joanna Dennehy was remanded into custody soon after arrest to await her day in court, but incarceration did not stop her plotting acts of violence. In September 2013, prison officers at H.M.P. Bronzefield found an escape plot written in her diary. This plan involved killing or seriously injuring a prison officer, cutting off their finger, and using this to fool the biometrics in the prison to escape. Dennehy was placed in solitary confinement, and was produced for her court appearances under extremely high security. On the 18th of November 2013, at the Old Bailey in London, to the surprise of many, Joanna Dennehy pleaded guilty to all 3 murders and 2 counts of attempted murder. Gary Stretch was subsequently convicted after trial of 3 counts of preventing the lawful burial of a corpse and 1 count of attempted murder. His argument was that he was scared of Dennehy and had no choice but to help her. However, whilst awaiting the verdict in his trial, prison authorities intercepted letters between Stretch and Dennehy, which are frankly pathetic. In one of these he wrote, quote, "Right, stop blaming yourself for me being in this with you. It was my own choices, babe, 'cause I'm my own person. I can make up my own mind, so get off that trip." In another message he admits, quote, "Mad choices have been my undoing. It's not your fault. You did tell me to leave, but I never." He also promises, quote, "I'll do anything for you, which I've already proven to you. You're the one woman I ever truly loved." He signed the letter off as, quote, "Your personal undertaker." Now, I'm not a criminal genius, but I think it's probably pretty dim to write a letter that blows your entire defence out of the water. But this letter shows the continued pathetic, simpering loyalty that Gary Stretch had towards Joanna Dennehy, a woman whose association with had destroyed his life. I wonder if, in the years since, Stretch has worked out just how meaningless he was to her, like everyone was in Dennehy's life, and he was just another mark, used to get what she wanted. Anyway, Leslie Layton was found guilty of 2 counts of preventing the lawful burial of a body and 1 count of perverting the course of justice. Before sentencing, Joanna Dennehy was assessed by a psychiatrist, to whom she disclosed she had killed to see how it felt and, quote, "to see if I was as cold as I thought I was. Then it got moreish, and I got a taste for it." Dennehy said that she had absolutely no remorse for the murders, but oddly stated that she regretted the attempted murders of the 2 men she targeted at random. Dennehy was revelling in discussing her offending, and her statements were not just confined to the conversations with the psychiatrist. She also wrote a letter directly to the judge, saying that she had no remorse, but again claimed that she regretted the other 2 offences, something the judge utterly rejected. As well as having antisocial personality disorder and traits of psychopathy, Dennehy was assessed as being sadomasochistic, i.e. deriving pleasure both from the giving and receiving of pain. She would apparently also frequently watch violent pornography. On the 28th of February 2014, Joanna Dennehy, Gary Stretch and Leslie Layton appeared at the Old Bailey for sentencing before Mr. Justice Spencer. Dennehy was seen smirking in the dock as the judge delivered his sentencing remarks. With regards to her, Justice Spencer rejected any implication that she felt any remorse for any of her crimes, and he described her as, quote, "a cruel, calculating, selfish and manipulative serial killer." With regards to Gary Stretch, Justice Spencer said that, as opposed to being scared of Dennehy, he was a willing participant and he revelled in her criminality and the media attention the offences would bring. With Leslie Layton, the judge dispelled any claim that he'd made about being afraid or coerced into any of the behaviour he'd been convicted of, with him pointing out that when he came across the body of John Chapman, he did not panic or raise the alarm. Instead, he took a photograph on his phone as some sort of morbid keepsake. He then sentenced them. For the murders of Lukas Slabozewski, John Chapman and Kevin Lee, Joanna Dennehy was sentenced to a whole life order, meaning that she will never be released from prison. Gary Stretch was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum tariff of 19 years before he can apply for parole. Leslie Layton was sentenced to 14 years imprisonment, of which he was to serve half in prison and the other half on licence in the community. Therefore, he was likely released from prison in around 2021. Gary Stretch, likely beginning to realise the enormity of his situation, appealed his sentence as too severe in November 2014. His appeal was promptly rejected. Joanna Dennehy has been busy in prison. In 2018, she was granted permission to marry her cellmate, Hayley Palmer, and the pair apparently tried to kill themselves in a suicide pact later that same year. Dennehy told Haley that she had no regrets about the crime she committed. In May 2021, it was again reported that Dennehy and Haley were planning to marry, with Haley by this point having been released from custody. Haley disclosed letters that she'd been written by Dennehy, in which she stated, quote, "To me, you'll never be anything other than real. The first person to creep under my skin. You have a fully committed psychopath." Dennehy has also apparently made threats to kill Rose West, but they're currently in separate prisons. Joanna Dennehy is an anomaly, both in terms of her gender and her background, with female serial killers making up less than 20% of all known serial murderers, and those who do kill multiple people often having backgrounds of often horrific abuse. However, there is no evidence of abuse in Dennehy's background. She apparently grew up in a loving and happy household. However, I think in this case it's potentially things that happen outside the home, which is not disclosed, which are key to understanding the monster that Joanna Dennehy became. Specifically, it's recorded that Dennehy told people that she would not kill women or children, and she would only target men. I believe this was a twisted way of justifying the indefensible, but potentially gives an insight into her potential hatred of men, and that she felt that members of this gender were somehow fair game. A hatred of women has been speculated as being a motivating factor underpinning the murders of many male serial killers, including Ted Bundy and Levi Belfield, so potentially a hatred of men is a factor in the actions of some female serial killers. An obvious case is that of Eileen Wuornos, who had a history of being abused by males and who killed 7 men between 1989 and 1990 in Florida. If Dennehy did indeed have a hatred of men, I wouldn't be surprised if he had something to do with her wayward behaviour as a teenager, where she was drunk and high, and likely preyed upon by men who used her for their own purposes. This is unfortunately a common occurrence. There's a curious dichotomy with Dennehy, as, if she did indeed hate men, she also relied on them heavily to get what she wanted in her life. However, I don't think this meant she liked men. Potentially she saw those she came into contact with as weak and just a means to an end. Someone in my comments once mentioned about neurodevelopmental issues as potentially being linked to acts of violence and murder, and potentially this is true in the case of Dennehy. Perhaps there were issues in her brain development, which meant that areas linked to empathy and impulse control did not develop properly. These underlying issues would likely have been compounded by her heavy drug and alcohol use as a teenager, leading Joanna Dennehy to be a ticking time bomb, someone with no empathy, a propensity for violence, a lack of impulse control, and no remorse for her behaviour. It's also clear that sexual gratification played a part in Dennehy's offending, with her gaining sexual excitement from violence towards others. This is similar to many other cases. The one that springs to mind is Andrei Chikatilo, known as the Rostov Ripper, who killed at least 52 people between 1978 and 1990 in the Soviet Union. He was a man who gained sexual excitement from stabbing his victims to death, often to the point of orgasm. Whether anyone will ever understand Joanna Dennehy is unclear. She's been described as a pathological liar. So even if she told people the truth about how her issues started, would anyone believe her? Regardless, Joanna Dennehy will spend the rest of her life behind bars, and I'd be surprised if we've heard the last of her. Peter Tobin was a Scottish serial killer, rapist, paedophile, and sadistic domestic abuser who murdered a minimum of 3 young women between 1991 and 2006, but it's likely he killed many more and began killing earlier than is currently known. A psychopath, Tobin showed no remorse or empathy for anyone, and despite clear evidence of his guilt, never admitted his crimes and refused to give closure to the families of any of his victims. This was a man who had no redeeming qualities and was simply evil. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Peter Brisson Tobin was born on the 27th of August 1946 in the town of Johnston in the west central lowlands of Scotland. The second of 8 children, Tobin began to show delinquent behaviour from a young age, with him being described as, quote, wild by one of his brothers. He showed early signs of having no regard for the welfare of others or following the rules, and was violent from a young age. By the age of 7, he was sent to a reform school which, as the name suggests, was the type of environment where these children received an education and attempts were made to reform them. In the early 1960s, Peter Tobin apparently spent time in Borstal for minor offences. As stated in a previous video, Borstals were a type of youth detention centre in the United Kingdom, which existed between the early 1900s and the 1980s, and were often horrific environments, characterised by abuse both from staff and between the boys. However, in the case of Tobin, I imagine he was the abuser, and used this environment to victimise others and indulge his sadistic tendencies. In August 1969, 22-year-old Tobin married 17-year-old Margaret Mountney after a brief relationship when they met at a club they both used to go to called the Barrowlands. Margaret was drawn to the suave and sophisticated man that Tobin projected, and he would treat her with days out and introduced her to his parents. However, this all changed when they moved into a flat together in East Glasgow. Behind closed doors, Tobin's mask evaporated, and he subjected Margaret to horrific abuse. The marriage only lasted a year, but in this time, she was repeatedly beaten and locked in the flat by her husband. Margaret was also raped at knife point by Tobin on several occasions. The most horrific incident that Margaret was subjected to began with Tobin showing annoyance about the barking of their pet puppy named Boot, which he'd bought her. Margaret later said in an interview in 2008 that she discovered Boot missing one day and went looking for him. She recounts, quote, "I ran down to the yard and I said, 'Where's Boot?' And one guy said, 'His head's over there and his body's over there.'" Tobin had decapitated the puppy, apparently in order to, quote, "shut it up." And when Margaret complained, Tobin brutally beat her and then raped her whilst holding a serrated knife to her throat. He then inserted the knife inside her, causing horrific internal injuries. Blood from this act seeped through the floor and through the ceiling of the downstairs tenants, who called the police, and Margaret was taken to hospital. She spent weeks in hospital, but was too terrified of Tobin to make a complaint to the police. Tragically, the extent of her injuries was such that Tobin had robbed her of the chance of ever having children. Margaret was finally able to flee the marriage when, in 1970, Tobin was sentenced to 5 years in prison for forgery and burglary, and I have little doubt if he had not been removed from her life, she would have been murdered. Tobin served half his sentence and was released in late 1972 or early 1973, and within weeks, he'd met and married a 30-year-old nurse called Sylvia Jeffries in Brighton, where he relocated to. In an interview in 2008, Sylvia outlined the horror she endured at the hands of Tobin. Like his first wife, Sylvia was drawn in by the intelligent, well-spoken man that Tobin pretended to be. But, once they married, he believed he owned her and could do whatever he wanted. The pair had a pet dog, and Tobin would abuse this animal, assaulting it and swinging it around by its collar. Sylvia would also be beaten, and she remembered being threatened by Tobin whilst he was holding a knife to her neck, shouting, quote, "I'm going to kill you." Tobin would strangle Sylvia during sex, and use of violence seemed to be the only way he could become aroused. The pair had a son and a daughter who unfortunately died during infancy, but it was clear that Tobin had no regard for his children, and Sylvia recalls Tobin being annoyed by the rocking of their son's crib, and her, due to pure terror, going over to the baby and saying, quote, please be quiet, you'll make him crosser." Sylvia knew she had to escape the marriage, and in 1976, after 3 years of hell, she was able to do so with the help of a woman's refuge. She stated, quote, "I just literally got to carry a bag with some stuff for my child and a pushchair. That's all we had. I can't explain the fear that I had. If he'd have come back, he would have killed me." Sylvia was then helped to get a permanent restraining order, prohibiting Tobin from ever contacting her or their son ever again. Peter Tobin then appears to disappear for almost 10 years, with police being unable to find any real trace of his movements during this time, with them believing that he joined a motorcycle club called the Rising Sun, living a nomadic lifestyle across the country. However, there's potentially another reason for this, as Peter Tobin was a man who frequently changed names and vehicles in order to remain anonymous and move without detection. Tobin is believed to have used over 40 aliases throughout his life, stayed in over 20 different locations, used 40 different phone numbers, and used over 150 vehicles to travel from place to place and cover his tracks. Tobin next reappeared in 1984 when he was living in Portsmouth, Hampshire, during which time an 8-year-old girl reported that she'd been raped repeatedly by him over a number of months. The police were called, but Tobin was not prosecuted due to insufficient evidence. In 1986, Peter Tobin met 16-year-old Kathy Wilson in Brighton, and within 3 weeks, she was living with him. By this point, Tobin was 40 years old, so double Kathy's age, and it's clear that he was targeting younger women, likely for 2 reasons. As I mentioned in a previous video, I believe this was to more easily be able to control his partners due to the difference in age causing an obvious power disparity in the relationship. However, secondly, I believe it's indicative of his sexual attraction to children and young women who would become his future victims. Soon after meeting Kathy, she gave birth to her son Daniel, and in August 1989, they married and moved to a house in Robertson Avenue in the town of Bathgate, West Lothian, Scotland. Within this house, Kathy was subjected to horrific abuse. In an interview in 2022, Kathy said, quote, "Throwing his dinner at me, putting his hands around my throat became routine. I was his slave. Even when I went into labour, he refused to take me to hospital until I'd cooked a roast dinner for him and some friends. I was scared to cross him and felt completely tied." Kathy also stated that Tobin would call her a, quote, "useless bitch," or, quote, "slut." He used her to live out his depraved rape fantasies and regularly bring home prostitutes and forced Kathy to watch him assault, hit, gag, and strangle these women. Tobin would specifically pick emaciated small women akin to children, again demonstrating his paedophilic inclination. Tobin would also threaten to murder their son. Kathy too knew she had to leave or she would die, as she began to hide money, and in April 1990 she'd saved enough money to flee across the border into England with Daniel, eventually moving to Portsmouth, inevitably saving her life. After this, Peter Tobin began committing the murders that had been proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Peter Tobin's first confirmed victim was 15-year-old Vicky Hamilton, who was last seen on the 10th of February 1991 at a bus stop in Bathgate in Scotland, waiting to return home to her family. This bus stop was less than a mile away from where Tobin was living at the time. What happened next will never be known with certainty, but the most likely scenario is that Tobin pulled up beside Vicky and offered her a lift, and when she was in the vehicle, he drove her to his property in Robertson Avenue, forced her inside, and then attacked and killed her. Her remains were not found for almost 2 decades, so her cause of death could not be determined, but it appeared she'd been beaten, raped, and strangled to death. Tobin then hid Vicky's body, likely in an upstairs bedroom, and when he found a new property to move to, Margate, Kent, he cut Vicky's body in half and wrapped the pieces in curtain and bin bags. On the 21st of March 1991, he drove the almost 500 miles to his new property with her remains in the car. His new address, 50 Irvine Drive, would be central to his exposure as a serial killer decades later. Soon after moving in, Tobin was seen by a neighbour digging a hole in the garden, who he told he was creating a sandpit for his son. A few days later, the neighbour saw the hole had been filled in, not realising that he was looking at the resting place of Vicky Hamilton. Just 6 months after killing Vicky Hamilton, Peter Tobin claimed his second victim, 18-year-old Dinah McNichol, an 18-year-old sixth form student from Tillingham, Essex, who was last seen alive on the 5th of August 1991. On this date, she was hitchhiking home with her boyfriend, David Tremlett, from a music festival in Litcook, Hampshire. Dinah was at the music festival as part of a summer of relaxation before taking the next step in her life. She was described as an intelligent woman, as she had recently passed 4 A-levels, but she would never know her results. Eventually, the pair were picked up by Tobin, and at junction 8 of the M25, near Reigate in Surrey, David was dropped off. He asked Dinah whether she wanted to come back to his house, but she said she just wanted to get home, so she stayed in the vehicle with Tobin, and the car drove away. She was never seen alive again. Again, Dinah's remains were not discovered for almost 2 decades, and it became apparent that she'd been drugged, gagged and bound, with her hands being found tied behind her back, She was then raped and likely strangled to death. It's unclear where Dinah was murdered, but Tobin took her body back to 50 Irvine Drive, wrapped it in bin bags, and then buried it in the garden, mere feet away from the remains of Vicky Hamilton. In 1993, Peter Tobin again relocated, this time moved to Havant in Hampshire, apparently to be close to his son Daniel, who, as I stated, had moved to Portsmouth with his mother, Kathy Wilson, who fled their marriage in 1990. Whilst Kathy wanted nothing to do with Tobin, she wanted her son to have an opportunity to know his father, and so he would sometimes stay with him. However, as if to epitomise the absolute lack of regard for anyone but himself, on August the 4th, 1993, Tobin used his son to lure two 14-year-old girls into his flat under the guise of giving them a babysitting job. Once in the flat, Tobin threatened them with a knife, bound them, forced them to take drugs which made them drowsy, and then raped both children, including one anally. He also stabbed one of the girls. This was all whilst his son Daniel, who was around 3 or 4 years old at the time, was in the property, but in a separate room. Daniel then walked in and interrupted, at which point Tobin turned on the gas in the property and took his son, giving him back to his mother, and then disappeared. By some miracle, after 5 hours of sitting on a property full of gas, one of the girls managed to loosen her bindings and escape to notify the police. A manhunt was started for Peter Tobin, who was by now going by the name Peter Wilson, and he sought solace in a religious community called the Jesus Fellowship. However, the crime and a photograph of Tobin were featured on the BBC programme Crime Watch, a show similar to America's Most Wanted in the States. The community contacted the police and Tobin was arrested. On the 18th of May 1994, at Winchester Crown Court, Tobin admitted his guilt to raping and abusing the two girls and was sentenced to 14 years in prison. The authorities believed they were locking up a dangerous sex offender. Little did they know, they had apprehended a man who had killed at least 2 young women and would continue to kill as soon as he was re-released. Peter Tobin was released in 2004, at age 58, and returned to Scotland, moving to the town of Paisley, close to the town where he was born. Due to the nature of his conviction, Tobin was required to check in with the police regularly, but he soon disappeared, and in November 2005, an arrest warrant was issued when he moved out of Paisley without notifying police. However, Tobin used his skills to evade capture, and, going by the name Pat McLaughlin, he actually did not go far, moving to Glasgow, approximately 12 miles away. By September 2006, Peter Tobin was working as a church handyman at St Patrick's Church in Anderston, in the centre of Glasgow, and it was here that he met his last victim. Angelika Kluk was a Polish national, at just 23 years old when she died. She was working at the church as a cleaner in order to finance her Scandinavian studies at university. She was last seen alive in the company of Peter Tobin on the 24th of September 2006. Angelika was a conscientious, polite and reliable person, and when she did not arrive for work, the police were called. An extensive search was conducted, and on the 29th of September 2006, 5 days after last being seen alive, Angelika's body was found concealed in an underground chamber beneath the floor near the confessional in the church under a tarpaulin. Angelika had been raped, viciously beaten, and stabbed 16 times, and her hands were found bound behind her back. It's believed that Angelika was still alive, although likely only for a short time, when her body was placed under the floorboards, where she bled to death. Fingerprints found at the scene showed that Pat McLaughlin was in fact Peter Tobin, who by this point had escaped to London, and the nationwide manhunt was begun. On the 1st of October 2006, Tobin went to a hospital in London due to an issue with his heart and gave a false name, hoping this would throw anyone off his tracks. It did not work. He was recognised as being a wanted man from police alerts, and he was finally arrested. Peter Tobin gave no information to the police and appears to have been as obstructive and obnoxious as possible when dealing with authority figures. However, in the case of Angelika Kluk, the police did not need anything from him. They had overwhelming forensic evidence, and he was charged with her murder within 6 days of his arrest. Tobin pleaded not guilty to murdering and raping Angelika, but was convicted of both charges at the High Court in Edinburgh after a 6-week trial that ran between 23rd of March and the 4th of May 2007. Judge Lord Menzies described Tobin as, quote, an evil man, and stated, quote, any case of rape is serious, any case of murder is serious, but what you did to Angelika Kluk was inhuman. He then sentenced him. For the rape and murder of Angelika Kluk, Peter Tobin was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term for 21 years before he could apply for parole. With Peter Tobin safely behind bars, the police coordinated across areas, leading to Operation Anagram being established in 2006. The purpose of this task force was to trace Tobin's movements throughout his life in order to link him to unsolved murders or eliminate him from inquiries. It's like the police, in conjunction with psychologists and psychiatrists, realised how dangerous Tobin was and that he had likely killed other women, but I think their concerns were galvanised when, in prison, he claimed to have killed 48 people. There was no evidence this is true, but it likely reinforced the police that they had no idea how many people Peter Tobin had actually killed. Their inquiries led them to search his former property in Robertson Avenue in the town of Bathgate. Within this property, the police found DNA evidence showing that Vicky Hamilton had been there. Police then searched 50 Irvine Drive in Margate and, acting on intelligence, began to dig up the garden. Finally, on the 14th of November 2007, police recovered the remains of Vicky Hamilton, and 2 days later, on the 16th of November 2007, the body of Dinah McNichol was found, enabling both women to be given a decent burial almost 20 years after they'd been murdered. Peter Tobin was tried separately for the murders of Vicky Hamilton and Dinah McNichol. In both cases, Tobin, despite overwhelming evidence of his guilt, including his DNA being found on the wrappings on both bodies, pleaded not guilty and forced the offences to go to trial. With regards to Vicky, on the 2nd of December 2008, Tobin was found guilty of murder after trial at the High Court in Dundee. The judge stated, quote, "You stand convicted of the truly evil abduction and murder of a vulnerable young girl in 1991, and thereafter of attempting to defeat the ends of justice in various ways over an extended period. Yet again, you have shown yourself to be unfit to live in a decent society. It's hard for me to convey the loathing and revulsion that ordinary people will feel for what you have done. I fixed the minimum period which you must spend in custody at 30 years. Had it been open to me, I would have made that period run consecutive to the 21-year custodial period that you're already serving." By the time of this sentence, Peter Tobin was in his 60s, so a new sentence of a minimum of 30 years was essentially confirming that he would die in prison, but this was guaranteed after the conclusion of the trial for the murder of Dinah McNichol before Mr. Justice Calvert Smith at Chelmsford Crown Court. On the 16th of December 2009, after only 15 minutes deliberation, the jury found Tobin guilty of murder. Justice Calvert Smith then sentenced him, stating, quote, "The mandatory life sentence in this case has to be accompanied by a whole life order. Therefore, this confirmed that Peter Tobin would spend the rest of his life behind bars." Peter Tobin was sent to H.M.P. Edinburgh and received some retribution for his crimes, including on the 1st of July 2015 when he was attacked with a razor blade whilst he was asleep, which resulted in a 20-centimetre long scar running down his face and neck. By October 2022, Peter Tobin was in ill health, suffering from cancer, and was transferred to the Edinburgh Royal Infirmary. I wouldn't normally post a picture of someone so vulnerable in the hospital, but here is an image of Tobin, chained to the bed, alone, dying. The police made one final plea to Tobin to reveal the details of other murders he committed, but he remained silent. And on the 8th of October 2022, at the age of 76, Peter Tobin died in hospital. No one came forward to claim his body, so he was cremated and his ashes scattered at sea. The police investigated Tobin's potential connection to in excess of 15 unsolved murders and disappearances of young women and children across the UK, Ireland and Scotland. Some of these offences appear unlikely to have been committed by Tobin, but there are at least two that seem likely. The first of these is the disappearance of 18-year-old Louise Kay, who disappeared on the 24th of June 1988, when, after a night out with friends, she said that she was going to sleep in her car at Beachy Head in Eastbourne, in East Sussex. This was something that she'd done before. However, Louise then disappeared, and her body and a hand-painted gold Ford Fiesta car have never been recovered. Peter Tobin was known to be working in Eastbourne at the time of the disappearance, and apparently was trying to sell a hand-painted car. It appears that researchers, police officers, and psychologists believe that Peter Tobin was likely responsible for the disappearance and likely murder of Louise Kay, with them believing that he buried her body somewhere known only to him. The second case was that of the murder of 22-year-old Jessie Earle, who vanished, again in Eastbourne, sometime between the 15th and the 18th of May 1980. Her skeletonized remains were found in 1989 as she'd been bound with her own bra. Again, Tobin is believed to have been living and working a short distance away from where Jessie disappeared. Unfortunately, no firm evidence has ever been recovered to definitively identify Peter Tobin as the murderer of any other young girls or children, and, given his death, he's inevitably taken his secrets to the grave with him. Before speaking about Peter Tobin, I want to play a very short clip for you. I'll explain why in a moment. The reason why I added this clip was because I'm always fascinated what these people look like when they're actually committing their offences. I sometimes find it difficult to reconcile the outwardly calm person who appears in court and the monster their poor victims must have experienced in their last moments alive. However, sometimes they let the mask slip. Ted Bundy did this on at least one occasion, and I believe that this is Peter Tobin doing the same. You get a flash of just a fraction of the true monster that he was, a devil in human form. With regards to him, I've read that Tobin was a psychopath, but I cannot see when he was diagnosed or whether this is even a formal diagnosis. However, I've no doubt it's true. He clearly had no remorse for any of his actions, and behind his suave and confident demeanour was a spider just waiting to draw women into his web, and when he caught them, he subjected them to horrific acts of violence, rape, and eventually murder. At the core of Tobin's behaviour, aside from no empathy for others and remorse for his behaviour, I think of two things. Firstly, a hatred of women, and secondly, sadistic sexual interests. I think the best example of this is actually his behaviour towards his partners. As I've stated in previous videos, the most common profile of domestic abuse perpetrators are those who seek to control in order to ensure they're not abandoned. However, Peter Tobin is different, and, in my opinion, represents the most dangerous type of domestic abuser, which, given how insidious and often fatal it is really saying something. What I mean by this is that it's clear that Tobin was a nomad. He seemed quite content to move around the country, uprooting his life frequently, and, from what I can see, had no real social connection or friends. So this indicates that Tobin abusing his partners was not about trying to stop a partner from leaving him. He didn't care about this. I think it was just about torturing women. The abuse that he subjects his partners to, I can only conclude came from a deep hatred of females. But where this came from and why, I can't say. It's clear that the violence used by Tobin sexually excited him, with one of his wives indicating this was the only way he could get aroused. So I have no doubt that raping women was his fixation, with their terror and cries likely heightening his sense of gratification. This man was a monster, an inhuman specimen who took so much and gave nothing during his miserable existence. I have no doubt that Peter Tobin killed far more people than we will ever know, as I find it inconceivable that a man with his proclivity to violence would suddenly start killing at the age of 44 and kill 2 women within 6 months of each other, having never done this before. I doubt, as Tobin claimed, he killed over 40 people. I think this was just a narcissistic boast from a pathetic little man, but I wouldn't be surprised if the true number, although we'll never know, is above 10.